Hello everyone, I'm here to tell you a few frightening tales today. I know you use this video to help you fall asleep, so I'm here to help you with that. By the way, where are you from and what time are you watching this video? Make yourselves comfortable and relax. If possible, subscribe to the channel and give it a like. I felt a strange chill the first time I entered that small house. That place was different. It was so quiet that it made me uneasy. The owner mentioned that there was an attic, but didn't say much else. When I asked why it was closed, he shrugged and said it hadn't been opened in a long time. That was all he said. At that moment, I decided I wanted to see what was hidden up there. On moving day, I carried boxes and small pieces of furniture inside. The house had one bedroom, a bathroom, and a small living room connected to a narrow kitchen. The walls looked worn, and the paint was cracked near the ceiling. A single window in the living room faced the street. When I stood in the center of the room, I noticed the soft outline of a door in the ceiling, but there was a padlock hanging from an old lock. It looked old, with rust all over the surface. I reached out and pulled, but it didn't budge. That night, I lay down on my small sofa after unpacking most of my things. I stared at the closed door to the attic. The landlord's vague attitude made me uneasy. Why wouldn't he tell me what was up there? And why keep it locked if it was just a simple attic with nothing of value? I tried to distract myself by turning on the TV, but my eyes kept wandering back every few seconds. I ended up falling asleep there in the living room with the TV on low. The next morning, I couldn't ignore my curiosity. I decided to go buy a screwdriver. The nearest hardware store was about 5 blocks away. It was a hot, sunny day, and I remember sweating as I walked along the cracked sidewalks. The neighborhood seemed old and a little run down, with faded store signs and peeling paint on the houses. But there was something about it that I also found appealing. It was quieter than I was used to. I found the store, picked out a sturdy screwdriver, and headed back. When I got home, I climbed onto a chair and tried to force the lock open. The metal of the lock was brittle and made a squeaky noise when I applied pressure. I spent a few minutes jiggling and pushing the tip of the screwdriver into the opening. Suddenly, the lock popped open with a loud bang that echoed throughout the room. My heart raced, and I felt a small surge of triumph. I lowered the folding ladder that was attached to the trap door and climbed up. Immediately, there was a musty smell, like old cardboard and stagnant air. The attic was darker than I had expected. A single dusty window on the opposite side let in a faint ray of light. I turned on the flashlight on my cell phone and examined the space. I saw boxes stacked against the walls, all covered in thick layers of dust. Cobwebs hung from the low beams. I noticed a large shape leaning against one of the walls. It was a large mirror with an ornate metal frame. The glass looked old and had smudges on it. I approached and pointed the light from my cell phone at it. My reflection looked blurry, and I couldn't see my face clearly. The floorboards creaked under my feet, and suddenly I felt uneasy. I couldn't hear anything but my own breathing. I looked around, checked some boxes, but most of them were empty. I didn't find anything strange. After a few more minutes, I went downstairs, closed the trap door, and locked it again. Over the next few days, I focused on my usual routine. I tidied up my room, set up my computer on a small table, and found a decent place for my TV. I had to get used to the quieter environment at night. In my old apartment, there was always some background noise. Here, everything was completely silent after 9 o'clock. On the third night, I woke up to a noise right above me. It was faint, like soft footsteps, or maybe something sliding across the floor. I sat up in bed and held my breath, trying to figure out what I was hearing. It lasted about 10 seconds, and then stopped. My heart was pounding, but after a while I calmed down and told myself I was probably imagining things. Maybe the house was settling, or a branch was brushing against the ceiling. But my gut told me it wasn't just the house settling. The next day, I decided to check the attic again. When I went up, I saw the same boxes, the same dusty window, and the same large mirror. But this time I noticed some faint marks on the surface of the mirror. They looked like handprints or finger-shaped smudges. My first thought was that I might have accidentally touched it when I was there before. I rubbed the glass with an old rag and saw that the marks disappeared, leaving only streaks of dust. I didn't see anything else suspicious, so I closed the trap door and went back downstairs. The noises didn't stop. They occurred randomly, sometimes late at night, sometimes early in the morning. It always sounded like someone was walking around in the attic. I would jump out of bed, turn on the lights, and stare at the ceiling. My heart would race, and I could feel sweat beating on my forehead. Each time, I told myself to stay calm and go check it out, but every time I went upstairs, the attic was empty. No footprints, no signs of movement, and no clues. By the end of the first week, I was sleeping very poorly. I would wake up at the slightest noise. My shoulders were tense, and my stomach was in knots. One morning, after a restless night, I went upstairs once more. The beam of light from my flashlight illuminated the mirror, and I saw some new marks. They were larger and clearer, like two handprints pressed hard against the glass. The shape of the fingers was almost perfect, and you could see where the dust had been wiped away. I felt a wave of fear wash over me. I wiped them again, this time pressing them with my hand to compare the size. These prints seemed slightly larger than mine, and the spacing between the fingers was different. This discovery made my pulse race. I began to think of possible explanations. Maybe someone had broken in, maybe the owner had a key to the house, or maybe there was another entrance to the attic. However, it didn't make sense. Nothing else had been disturbed, no boxes had been moved, and nothing was missing from my room. I checked the doors and windows for signs of forced entry, but found none. A few nights later, I was watching television around midnight. I heard the attic floorboards creak again, this time louder than before. They sounded like slow, deliberate footsteps above my head. My chest tightened. I turned off the TV and listened. The footsteps continued for a few seconds. Then there was a scratching noise. It reminded me of metal being dragged across wood. I got up, grabbed the flashlight, and went upstairs. My hand was shaking on the step as I pushed myself up. I shone the light around. Everything was silent. I walked over to the mirror and crouched down in front of it. My reflection looked strange, but I couldn't identify why. It looked like the glass was distorted, or maybe dust was creating a strange pattern. My breathing was shallow, and I could hear my heart beating. I tried tapping the surface of the mirror, hoping it would move or rattle, but it remained in place. Then I heard a loud thud behind me. I turned around, pointing the flashlight at the boxes, but I didn't see anything moving. The noise came from near the stairs. I ran to check the area, but the attic was empty. My stomach was in knots and my hands were clammy. I went downstairs, closed the trap door, and sat on the sofa, feeling tense. Over the next few days, I felt more determined to find out what was going on. I examined every inch of the house, looking for hidden doors or cracks. I found none. I stayed up late with the lights off, waiting to hear the sounds. They came and went, always unpredictable. Sometimes they were faint, other times louder. My mind began to play tricks on me, but I tried to stay sane. One night, I decided to record the sounds from the attic. I left my phone on a chair in the living room and set it to record audio before going to bed. Around 3 a.m., I heard footsteps above me again. My chest tightened, but I didn't move. I forced myself to stay still and let the phone record. The sound stopped after a minute. The next day, I listened to the recording. There was a soft crackling sound, followed by a long scratching noise. It wasn't the house settling. It sounded very steady, very deliberate. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end. I went upstairs that afternoon, determined to inspect the mirror again. As soon as I shone the light on it, I saw new handprints, more defined than ever. The outlines looked dark against the dusty glass. as if someone had pressed their palms against it and dragged them down. I felt a chill run down my arms. I tried to wipe them off again, but they left a slight residue. The mirror was cold, colder than I expected. I decided to move it. I tried to lift it, but it was heavier than it looked. I managed to slide it a foot or two away from the wall. I wanted to see if there was anything behind it. I found only an empty space, an old insulation. Nothing else. That night I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed imagining those handprints reappearing. My body was tense, and I had trouble breathing deeply. Around 2 in the morning, I heard a single crash in the attic. I jumped up, my heart racing and my mouth dry. I got out of bed and looked at the trapdoor in the living room. It was still closed. I walked over, crouched down, and listened. Nothing. I crossed my arms and pressed my ear against the trapdoor. Silence. It felt like there was something on the other side, waiting. I thought about leaving the house. I didn't have a lease that required me to stay long, but something about the situation kept me there. I wanted to understand what was going on. I told myself I just needed more evidence or some logical explanation. Still, the fear was real. My legs trembled every time I thought about going up there alone at night. A few days later, I decided to check out the attic in daylight. I felt safer with the sun shining through the windows. I grabbed a flashlight and a camera, intending to document whatever I saw. I climbed the stairs slowly. The smell of mold hit me again. I didn't hear any noises, just the distant hum of traffic outside. I walked over to the mirror and took some photos. I held the camera close to the glass and could see some faint marks, almost like recent fingerprints. My skin prickled and I felt a cold sweat on my forehead. I muttered to myself that I was going to find out what it was. I tried to stay in the attic for a while, thinking that maybe I could catch whatever was making those noises. I waited near the trapdoor, shining the flashlight every time I heard a small creak. After an hour, I gave up. The place remained silent. Nothing moved. I locked the door and went downstairs. That night, everything changed. I woke up to loud footsteps around me at around midnight. This time they were heavier, as if someone was walking back and forth. I felt my heart pounding. I grabbed the flashlight and stood in the living room, staring at the attic door. The footsteps continued, then I heard that scratching noise again, but it was louder, as if something was being dragged across the attic floor. I felt a lump in my throat. My pulse was pounding in my ears. I climbed the stairs slowly, every muscle tense. When I opened the trapdoor, the attic was dark. The beam of light from my flashlight trembled in my shaking hand. I called out, "Hello?" My voice echoed. There was no answer. I climbed up completely, stepping on the floorboards. I illuminated the space. Nothing moved. Then the beam of light fell on the mirror and my stomach turned. I saw 2 large handprints right in the center of the glass, shiny and fresh. It looked like someone had just pressed their hands there. The dust around them was disturbed and the outlines were clear. My mind raced. There was no one else in the attic. I was alone. I felt a chill run down my skin. I took a step forward, sweat running down both sides of my face. The air felt thick and stagnant. My flashlight flickered for a moment, and my heart almost stopped. I tapped it to keep it on. Then I heard a slight scratching sound on the other side of the attic, near the stacked boxes. I turned, shining the light in that direction. The boxes were still, but the noise continued for a few more seconds before stopping. I forced myself to breathe slowly. I walked around the attic, looking between the boxes. There was no sign of anything. My nerves were on edge. I knew I couldn't stay up there any longer. I ran back to the trapdoor and climbed down. I locked it and then inserted a small metal bar through the lock to secure it further. My whole body was shaking. I spent the rest of the night sitting on my sofa with the lights on, staring at the ceiling. My eyes were burning with fatigue, but I couldn't relax. It's been almost 2 weeks since then. I still hear those noises at odd times. The mirror still shows new handprints every time I look at it. I've taken pictures, but they just look like smudges on the glass. I can't prove there's anything up there, and I can't sleep well. I'm about to confront the landlord. I want answers. Part of me wants to keep investigating. Part of me wants to run away. But I won't leave until I understand what's going on in that attic. There's something about this place that refuses to let me rest until I get some clarity. I'll keep climbing those stairs, even though my heart races every time I grab the flashlight and open the trap door. I don't know what I'm going to find, but I can't ignore it anymore. Next story. I got out of the car and felt a brief sense of relief when I saw the small summer house I had rented. I wanted peace and quiet. I wanted to escape the traffic and crowded sidewalks. I wasn't expecting anything strange. I saw a faded porch, a single rocking chair, and windows that looked a little dusty. It was normal for a place that rarely had visitors. When I opened the front door, I felt the hot, stagnant air hit my face. It smelled like old furniture and slightly damp wood. I shrugged and went inside with my bags. I left them near a small sofa in the living room and turned on the ceiling light. I saw some simple furniture, a coffee table, some chairs, and a sofa with worn cushions. I was tired, so I decided to leave most of the unpacking for the next day. That's when I noticed a radio on a shelf on the wall. It looked old, with a bulky plastic case and a cracked handle on top. It was the kind of battery-powered radio you used to find decades ago. There was dust on the speaker grill. It looked like it hadn't been turned on in a long time. I wasn't interested in it, so I left it there. I just wanted to rest. I opened a few windows to let in some fresh air and then dragged my suitcase into the bedroom. I saw a single bed, a small dresser, and an old standing lamp. Everything was simple and basic, just what I wanted. My first night passed quietly. I fell asleep early. I woke up around 3 a.m. for no apparent reason. I got up to get a drink of water in the kitchen. It was dark, and the living room light was off. I noticed a faint glow coming from the radio on the shelf. That seemed impossible because I hadn't turned it on, or even checked to see if it had batteries. I went over and saw that the power light was on, and there was a faint static hiss coming from the speaker. I turned off the switch. The noise stopped. I was still half asleep, but I felt a little knot in my stomach. I didn't think much of it. I went back to bed. The next morning, I examined the radio. It had old batteries in it, the kind that looked like they'd been there for years. I figured the radio was faulty and had maybe turned itself on. I didn't throw it away because I didn't want to damage anything that belonged to the house. I just left it off. The rest of the day was relaxing. I took a walk around the property. I sat on the porch and read a paperback novel I'd brought with me. That night I fell asleep, watching an old rerun on the small TV in the living room. Sometime after midnight, I heard that static noise again. I opened my eyes and saw the radio light on in the darkness. The noise was louder this time. It sounded harsh, as if something was pressing against the speaker. I got up and turned it off again. I said aloud, "This thing is broken." My voice echoed a little in the silence. My hands were shaking a little, but I tried to ignore it. I went to bed feeling tense. Over the next week, this happened every night at the same time, usually between 2 and 3 in the morning. The radio turned on by itself. Sometimes the volume was so low that I only noticed it was on when I walked through the living room. Other times, the static was loud enough to wake me up. One morning, I finally said to myself, "Enough." I opened the battery compartment and took out the batteries. They were corroded and unpleasant to the touch. I left them on the shelf next to the radio. The radio seemed dead. I was sure it would stay that way. But the night after I removed the batteries, I was in bed again when I heard a click in the living room. I sat up and my heart began to pound. I went out and saw that bright green light glowing faintly on the radio dial. It was on again, even without batteries. The static was there, but it was interrupted by low voices. It was hard to tell what they were saying. It sounded like several people talking at once in muffled tones. I stood there in the dark, trying to figure out how this was possible. Then I reached for the radio. Just as my fingers touched the plastic, the station changed. I heard a deep voice say something like, "You are ignoring the signs." I froze. This wasn't a normal broadcast. It sounded like a direct statement about me. My neck tensed, and a chill ran down my arms. I turned off the radio, but my hand was shaking so much that I dropped it onto the shelf. I backed away, unable to take my eyes off it. I hardly slept that night. The next day, I tried to stay calm. I told myself there could be a logical explanation. Maybe the radio had some residual charge, or was picking up strange transmissions. I decided to stay up after midnight to see if I could catch it on. I sat in the living room with all the lights on. I had a cup of tea and tried to watch TV, but I couldn't concentrate on anything. My eyes kept drifting back to the radio. Every little creak in the house made me jump. Around 2:30 in the morning, I started to feel sleepy. My eyelids were heavy and my head was spinning. I woke up to a subtle scratching sound. I looked over at the radio. The dial needle moved slightly, even though no one was touching it. I leaned forward and watched as the needle slid to the right on its own. The power light came on, and then there was static. At first it was the usual crackling, but then I heard something that sounded like my name. It was faint, but I recognized the shape of the sound. Mike. My throat tightened. I turned off the switch and pulled the radio's plug out of the wall socket. I had forgotten that it could run on batteries as well as AC power, but I had already removed the batteries, so that meant it had switched to AC power on its own. I didn't even remember plugging it in. That confused me and made me feel shaky. I left it unplugged and put it in a closet. I closed the door and told myself that was the end of it. I tried to get on with my vacation. I read more, cooked simple meals, and sat outside in the evenings. But something seemed wrong. Every day as night fell, I noticed little things. The air seemed heavier at night. The house creaked more than usual. When I sat on the couch, I thought I heard soft clicks in the corner where the radio used to be. It reminded me of someone slowly turning a dial. I looked around and saw nothing. I got up and checked the closet, but the door was still closed. The radio was still inside. That didn't stop the feeling that something was nearby, playing with it. One night, halfway through my second week, I was in the living room with the TV on low. I was lying on the couch, almost asleep, when I heard the closet door creak. I got up and saw that it was open. It wasn't fully open, just a few inches, but I was sure I had closed it. My heart raced. I walked over and found the radio on the closet shelf. It was still unplugged with no batteries, but the power light flashed once and then went out again. I felt a wave of panic wash over me. My hands started to sweat and my mouth went dry. I closed the closet door and stood there. My mind raced. I decided to lock the closet door. If it had a lock, it did. I turned the small knob on the door handle and tried it. It was still locked. I tried to calm down. I drank a glass of water in the kitchen and watched the back door, waiting for something else to happen. I kept seeing shadows out of the corner of my eye. I turned my head, and the shadows didn't match any of the furniture. Sometimes I thought I saw a shape standing near the radio shelf, but when I blinked, it was just the edge of the sofa or a curtain. My forehead was cold. The hairs on my arms were standing on end. I couldn't stop thinking about the worst-case scenarios. But there was no one else around, and I saw no signs of forced entry. I told myself I had to stay calm. It was just me and some strange electrical glitch. I tried to watch TV until I fell asleep, but every 10 minutes I would wake up from a light sleep thinking I had heard static. The day before I left, I decided to keep myself busy and get out of the house as much as possible. I drove to the nearest supermarket. I walked around for a while, picked up random items, and avoided thinking about the radio. When I returned, I noticed a slight chill in the living room, even though it was a warm afternoon. The house seemed to be at a standstill again, and the smell of mold was stronger. I checked the thermostat, but it was set to a normal temperature. My nerves were on edge. I put some music on my phone to distract myself and started packing my things. I wanted to leave early the next morning. That night, I sat at the kitchen table with a sandwich and a glass of water. I stared at the closet door, which was still locked. I felt a strange tension in my chest. After eating, I sat down on the sofa. I turned on the TV to watch whatever was on. It was around 11 p.m. The house was dark except for the lamp next to me and the TV screen. At some point, the static started again. I realized it wasn't coming from the TV because the volume was low. It was coming from behind the closet door. It sounded muffled but loud enough to be heard through the door. I got up and walked toward it. My legs were shaking and I was breathing heavily. I pressed my ear against the door. I heard a strange voice. It was speaking in a low, distorted tone. It said a few words that sounded like my name again, followed by what sounded like incomplete sentences. "He's gone. He's locked it. You mustn't." Then it stopped. I stood there, my heart pounding, feeling sweat running down my neck. I tried the door handle, but it was still locked. I backed away. The static noise subsided. I waited in the living room, my eyes fixed on the closet. I felt like running to my car and driving away, but I also felt trapped. After a few minutes, I walked slowly toward the closet with my hand trembling on the doorknob. I unlocked it and opened the door. The radio was on the shelf. It was off, no static, no light. I touched it. It was cold and dusty. There were no signs of movement. I couldn't understand how it had turned on or how that voice had come out. My chest felt tight, and I breathed slowly to calm myself. That was my last night. I ended up sleeping fitfully. I left all the lights on. From time to time, I heard small clicks in the living room, but I didn't get up to check. I just covered my head with the blankets and waited for morning to come. My alarm went off at 7, and I got up. I quickly grabbed my suitcase and the few things I had in the dresser. I felt anxious. I opened the front door to let in some sunlight. The living room looked the same as when I arrived, except for the feeling that something was wrong. I stared at the shelf where the radio had been before I moved it. I felt slightly nauseous. My fingers were still shaking when I picked up my things and left. Before leaving, I locked the door. Then I realized I hadn't put the radio back where I found it. I hesitated, but I couldn't go back in. I felt like something was waiting for me to do so. I walked to my car, loaded my bags, and got in. As I drove away, I felt a chill run down my spine. Even now, I can't forget that memory. Sometimes I still hear static when I lie down to sleep in my own bed at home. I grab my phone, turn it on, and check to see if any apps are playing white noise. They never are. My mind goes back to that old radio. It turned on without batteries, repeated parts of conversations that I thought were about me, and made me feel like I was being watched. I don't have a real explanation. All I know is that I'll never go back to that house, not even if they paid me. I couldn't stand another night with that thing on, whispering my name in the dark. I just want to forget, but I don't think I ever will. Sometimes when the sun goes down, I still feel that knot in my stomach. I remember that voice, and I remember how the radio moved on its own. That's enough to keep me awake at night. I'm done with summer rentals. I'd rather stay home, even if it means putting up with the noise of the city. At least that noise is normal. Static and low voices at 3 a.m. are not. They stick with you. They get under your skin. I can't ignore them anymore. That house gave me more than just a bad vacation. It made me question every strange noise I hear when I'm alone, and it's a feeling I can't shake, no matter how many nights go by. I moved in on a Thursday afternoon. The building looked old on the outside, with peeling paint around the windows and a rusty fire escape attached to the side. I entered the lobby, carrying 2 boxes of kitchen utensils. The floor tiles were cracked, and there was a musty smell that reminded me of damp clothes. I saw a small pile of envelopes stacked near a row of mailboxes, all addressed to a guy named Marcos. At first, I didn't think much of it. People get mail after they move, but something about that pile made me stop. It looked like it had been there for quite some time. The edges of the envelopes were curled and yellowed. Still, I was focused on getting settled in. I took the keys out of my pocket and climbed the stairs to the third floor. When I reached my new door, I noticed fresh scratch marks on the threshold. It looked like someone had dragged heavy shoes or boots across it. I didn't think much of it. I set the boxes on the floor, put the key in the lock, and entered the apartment. Inside, the air felt stagnant, heavier than in the hallway. The living room had an old sofa, a wooden coffee table, and some dusty bookshelves. The kitchen was small, with an outdated refrigerator and a stovetop with dents on the sides. I remember checking the cupboards and seeing some cans of food that someone had left there. They were expired. I threw them in the trash. A little later, I met a woman named Donna Vera. She lived across the hall. She was short, with curly hair and a cautious expression. She saw me carrying another box and asked if I was the new tenant. I told her I was. She looked at the envelopes I was holding and frowned. Then she told me that the previous tenant had left in a hurry. "He just disappeared," she said. "He left most of his things here and left one night. We never saw him again. He didn't even say goodbye." His voice trembled a little. I asked him if he knew where he had gone. He said no. He added that he had never mentioned any travel plans and hadn't hired a moving company. He hadn't even bothered to change his address. At the time, I shrugged it off. I had other things on my mind. I wanted to unpack and assemble my bed. I spent the rest of the night organizing my clothes and trying to ignore a faint creaking sound that kept coming from the living room. I figured it was just the building settling in. I was tired and tried to go to bed early. The first night was quiet, but I remember feeling restless. My mattress was on the floor because I hadn't finished assembling the bed frame. Around 2 a.m. I heard the bathroom sink dripping. It wasn't a big deal, so I rolled over and forced myself back to sleep. The next morning, I got up and found the bathroom faucet dripping more than before. I turned the knob hard and it stopped. I noticed a faint smell of men's cologne in the bathroom. It wasn't mine, and it wasn't the kind I had left on the shelves. I sniffed around and then checked the ventilation. I figured it might be coming from another apartment. The walls were thin, and I could hear water running through the pipes upstairs whenever someone took a shower. After brushing my teeth, I walked into the living room. The front door was open. I was sure I had locked it the night before. My keys were still on the kitchen counter. I felt a jolt in my stomach, but I figured maybe I had forgotten to turn the lock. I made a mental note to be more careful in the coming days. Little things kept happening. I saw smudged footprints in the dusty hallway near the bedrooms. They weren't mine. My foot size is different, and I recognized the shape as something completely different. The footprints continued partially down the hallway and then disappeared. I started to question myself. Was I dragging dust around without realizing it? I checked the soles of my shoes. They were clean because I usually wipe them on the doormat. Besides, the footprints were larger, maybe 1 or 2 sizes bigger than mine. On the third night, I woke up around 1 a.m. to the sound of water dripping again. This time it wasn't just a drip. I heard a brief gush of running water, as if someone had turned on the tap for a few seconds. I sat up. My heart was pounding. I got out of bed, grabbed my phone, and walked carefully to the bathroom. The door was closed. I pushed it gently. The light was off, but I smelled that same cologne scent. Now it was stronger. When I turned on the light, the sink was wet and the faucet was dripping. I turned it off and wiped the counter with a towel. Then I heard a light tapping in the hallway. It sounded like wet footsteps on the floor. I followed the sound with my phone flashlight pointed ahead. I saw small puddles of water coming out of the bathroom, running down the hallway and into the living room. They stopped near the front of the couch. When I looked at the floor at that point, the water was gone. The wood wasn't wet, and there was no trace beyond that point. My hands were shaking a little, and my stomach was in knots. I felt exposed in my own home. I checked the front door. It was still locked. I stood there for a while, gripping the doorknob and breathing rapidly. Finally, I forced myself back to bed, but I didn't sleep well. The next day, I tried to talk to another neighbor, a middle-aged man named Jorge. I asked him if he remembered the guy who used to live in my apartment. He said he hardly ever spoke to him, but he remembered loud arguments through the walls. Jorge said Marcos would talk on the phone for hours, sometimes yelling. Then one night, everything went quiet. Jorge assumed the guy had moved out. He didn't know anything else. I asked him if anyone had looked for Marcos. He said no. I left with more questions. I started checking the hallway every morning, hoping to find some clue. The pile of mail grew. Some were late payment notices, others were generic advertisements. I recognized the last name on the envelopes, which matched the name on some magazines in my apartment. It looked like he had a subscription to a monthly health and fitness magazine. The covers had pictures of bodybuilders. That fit with the idea of a physically strong man. I wondered if he had left out of fear, or if something else had happened. Almost a week went by. Every night I heard the dripping in the bathroom. Sometimes it smelled like cologne, sometimes it didn't. I would wake up startled because it felt like someone was standing over my bed or sitting on the edge. I never saw anyone. One night, I was half asleep and turned over, and I could have sworn I felt another body next to me. There was a dip in the mattress that made me slide toward it a little. I froze. My skin crawled and my heart raced. I reached out, hoping to touch something solid, but there was only air. The dent in the mattress stayed for a few seconds, then rose again as if there had been pressure there. I couldn't explain it. I started sleeping with the light on in my room. I couldn't rest well. In the morning, my eyes were red and I felt nervous. I checked the locks twice every night. Even so, I would wake up and find the door open or slightly ajar. It got to the point where I was worried that maybe I was sleepwalking, so I stacked some boxes in front of the door to see if they moved the next day. The boxes were moved and the door was open. I didn't remember doing that. I called the landlord and asked if there was a spare key lying around. He said no, just the main set that Marcos had, which was never returned. I asked if Marcos had come back to look for anything. The landlord seemed confused. He didn't know of any official change. He just assumed the rent payments would eventually stop. He was behind on the paperwork and said he'd never checked. He apologized for the inconvenience and said he'd change the locks if I was concerned. I felt some relief. I scheduled a lock change for the following week. Before that happened, one last event pushed me over the edge. It was around 3 a.m. I was lying in bed, forcing myself to keep my eyes closed. The bathroom faucet dripped and then stopped. Then the hinges on the bedroom door creaked. I lay still, hoping it was my imagination, but I heard a slight shuffling on the floor. It was slow, as if someone was stepping carefully to avoid making noise. My heart was pounding. My arms were cold. I opened my eyes a little, just enough to see a shadow across the room. There was nothing there, but I could feel movement. Then I felt weight on the mattress again. It sank down on the other side, as if a heavy body had sat down. My breath caught in my throat. I started to sweat. I couldn't move. My whole chest felt tight. I heard a slight exhalation, as if someone was breathing. My eyes filled with tears. I squeezed them tightly and tried to push it away. After about a minute, the pressure on the mattress eased. I heard a soft sound, like footsteps crossing the room. The bedroom door creaked again. I threw off the blanket and ran to the light switch. The room was empty. I looked at the clock on my phone. It was 3:07 a.m. I touched the doorknob. It was damp, as if someone with wet hands had grabbed it. I shouted, "Who's there?" There was no answer. I stood at the door, listening intently. I heard nothing. I walked to the living room. The front door was still closed, but it wasn't locked. I locked it and started pacing back and forth. I didn't even bother trying to go back to sleep. I sat on the couch, checking every corner every few minutes. 2 days later, I changed the lock. The locksmith replaced everything, and I felt safer for about a week. The dripping from the faucet stopped on its own, which was strange. The smell of cologne disappeared. I thought maybe the weirdness was over. Then I noticed the footprints again. This time, they went from the hallway to my bedroom door. They were faint, but they were there. One Friday night, I got home late after meeting some co-workers for drinks. I was sober enough to notice the details. The moment I opened the door, I felt a cold spot in the living room. It was like walking into a room with the air conditioning on full blast, except I didn't have air conditioning. The cold spot moved. I walked around trying to figure out if there was a draft. The windows were all closed. That night I woke up to a loud bang near my bed. I jumped up, my heart pounding. I grabbed my phone and turned on the flashlight. I looked back at the dent in the mattress, but this time it seemed deeper, as if something heavier was pressing down on it. I couldn't take it. My body went rigid. My hands were shaking. I crawled out of bed, not taking my eyes off that spot. Slowly, it rose again. I heard short, shallow breathing right behind me. I turned around, shining the flashlight everywhere. I saw nothing. In the morning, the door was open again. I stepped out into the hallway feeling exhausted. I saw more letters for Marcos. It felt like an insult. He wasn't coming back, but something of him was still there. I couldn't get the idea out of my head that he had never really left. I decided I couldn't take it anymore. That same day, I packed my belongings as quickly as possible. I told the landlord I was leaving. I didn't care about breaking the lease. I just wanted to go. I moved out that afternoon. I left the keys on the kitchen counter. I didn't say goodbye to anyone. I loaded the boxes into the car, closed the trunk, and drove away. I felt a lump in my throat until I was at least a mile away from the building. When I finally looked in the rearview mirror, I let out a sigh I had been holding in. I never went back to get the security deposit. I didn't care. That's all I know. Marcos never showed up while I was there, but there was something about that apartment. I don't know what to call it. I'm not sure if it was him or something else. All I know is that I couldn't live with that presence. I still think about the footprints and the smell of cologne. I think about the door opening at night. I hate remembering lying in bed and feeling that change in the mattress, as if I wasn't alone. I've tried to get it out of my head, but sometimes I wake up in the middle of the night and wait to see those footprints again. I haven't told many people because it sounds ridiculous, but I experienced it and it still feels real to me. And that's all I have to say. Next story. I never planned to spend a night in that remote place. My trip was supposed to be simple. Drive to the city, find some clients, and be home in time for dinner. But a breakdown on the road changed everything. My car's engine started to misfire and wouldn't maintain a steady speed. I was stuck in the middle of nowhere, with the nearest town miles away. After a few frantic phone calls, I realized I had no other choice. I saw an old sign for a rural inn on the road, so I decided to see if they had a room. It was late, and I was tired. I just wanted a bed and a quick repair in the morning. As I pulled into the driveway, I felt a wave of relief. The place looked old, but the lights were on. The building was a single-story structure with a small second floor in the back. The walls were made of wood, and the paint was peeling. There was a wooden sign that read, Posada Vista do Lago, although I didn't see any lake. I was too tired to worry about that. I walked toward the door, my travel bag in one hand and my car keys in the other. Inside the lobby, the lighting was dim. The floor creaked with every step. There was an old reception desk that looked like it had been there for decades. I rang a small bell on the counter, and after a moment, a tall man in his 60s emerged from a room in the back. He was wearing a plaid shirt and looked at me, probably curious to know who would show up at this hour. He greeted me kindly, and I told him I was there on business, but that my car had broken down. I asked if there was a room available for the night. He said yes and seemed happy to have a guest. He led me down a narrow hallway with a few doors on either side. Everything smelled a little damp, like old furniture and stale air. He opened the door to a small room at the end of the hallway. Inside was a single bed with a thick wooden frame, a small desk, and a chest of drawers. The furniture looked old with scratches on the edges. There was a small window overlooking what looked like open fields. I noticed a painting hanging on the wall depicting a barn, and I remember thinking it was very dull and gray. The man handed me a key, told me there was a shared bathroom next door, and reminded me that breakfast would be ready at 7 a.m. if I wanted it. Then he left, closing the door gently behind him. I sat down on the edge of the bed and felt the springs pushing back against me. I was exhausted. I put on some comfortable clothes, brushed my teeth in the shared bathroom, and returned to my room. I turned off the lights and lay down. The sheets smelled clean, but the blanket was rough. I tried to ignore it. I just needed to sleep. After tossing and turning, I was about to fall asleep when I heard footsteps in the hallway. They were loud, heavy footsteps. They moved up and down, slow and deliberate. At first, I assumed it was the owner checking on something. Maybe he was carrying supplies or just walking around, but the noise didn't stop. They kept coming and going. I looked at my phone. It was almost 3 a.m. The footsteps seemed too steady for someone just going to the bathroom. They went from one end of the hallway to the other and back again. I thought about getting up to see what was going on, but I was exhausted and didn't want to intrude on the landlord's business. I figured it might be a quirk of the place. Maybe the man had a habit of walking around at night. I tried to cover my ears with my pillow. That helped a little, but I could still hear the creaking on the floor. Then I heard the footsteps stop right outside my door. The floor creaked, and I felt a wave of anxiety wash over me. I stared at the door. My heart began to pound. It was a feeling of anxiety that tightened my chest. The handle turned. The metal clicked. My mind froze. The door didn't open completely, but I saw a faint glow of light from the hallway seeping into the room. I grabbed the edges of the blanket. The door remained ajar for a few seconds. I waited for someone to come in, but nothing happened. Then the door closed again, very softly. I heard the click of the latch. The footsteps continued down the hallway, and then everything was quiet. I stood there in the dark, my eyes wide, staring at the door. My breathing was shallow, and I was sweating. My mind was racing. Was the landlord checking something? Had he forgotten something? Why had he opened my door like that? I hesitated between getting up and going to talk to him, but I felt an unsettling vibration. I decided to wait until the next morning. After another hour of disturbing thoughts, I managed to fall asleep. The next morning, I woke up stiff and uncomfortable. The sun was shining through the small window, and I realized I had slept later than usual. I looked at my phone. It was 8:15. I got up, got dressed for work, and went to find the owner. I found him near the front desk, drinking coffee and leafing through a magazine. I asked him if he needed anything during the night. I described the footsteps and mentioned that someone had opened my door. He looked at me with genuine surprise and told me that he had gone to bed around midnight. He insisted he hadn't left. I felt a chill in my stomach. I tried to keep my voice steady as I explained how loud the footsteps had been. He shrugged, apologized, and said it could have been the building settling or something. I knew that didn't make sense. That building had a bare hallway with creaky floors. Something was wrong, but I didn't press the issue. I just wanted to get my car fixed and get out of there as soon as possible. He pointed me to a small repair shop about 10 miles away, so I drove there slowly, worried that my car would break down again. The mechanic said he would need a few hours to diagnose the engine. That meant I had to stay around, so I decided to stop at a nearby cafe for lunch. The food was fine, but I couldn't stop replaying the events of the previous night in my mind. The footsteps, the handle turning, the door opening. It wasn't my imagination. I had heard it clearly and seen that dim light in the doorway. The mechanic finally called me and said the problem was more serious than he thought. He needed more time to find the parts. He told me it could take until the next day. I felt a knot in my stomach. I would need another night at the inn. I considered looking for a motel elsewhere, but everything was far away and I didn't want to risk driving my car any more than necessary. I returned to the hotel late in the afternoon, hoping that the second night would pass quickly. I parked the car and got out. I noticed how quiet everything was. There were trees in the distance and an empty field behind the building. I walked around a bit to stretch my legs. As I was returning to my room, I glanced toward the small window. My heart skipped a beat. I saw someone standing there. It was a silhouette, just a dark shape. I couldn't see any details, but it looked like a person standing in front of me. My body tensed up. I dropped my keys. When I picked them up and looked back, the figure was gone. I ran inside, took the hallway to my room and opened the door. There was no one there. The bed was untouched. The desk was the same, and the window was closed. My bag was where I had left it. I felt a tingling sensation on my neck. My stomach was churning. I searched every corner. I opened the closet. It was empty. I looked under the bed. There was only dust. I felt ridiculous, but I knew what I had seen. Someone was at the window. I closed the door behind me and locked it from the inside. I went to talk to the owner again. He was reading in a worn armchair near the lobby. I told him I had seen someone at my window. He seemed intrigued. He said there were no other guests and that he had been in the kitchen until recently. His tone was calm, but he seemed uncomfortable. I wondered if he knew something he didn't want to share. I didn't press him. I felt tired and tense. I asked if I could have an extra lamp or something for my room. He nodded and gave me a small lamp from a closet. Back in my room, I set up the extra lamp near the dresser. I thought that might help me feel less nervous if the space was brighter. Then I tried to distract myself by organizing some work files on my laptop. I reviewed the documents for the meeting I was supposed to have. I was annoyed by the delay, but I couldn't concentrate for very long. My mind kept returning to the events of the previous night. When it got dark outside, I felt my pulse quicken. I kept the main light on and the lamp on, but the corners still seemed gloomy. I decided to take a hot shower in the shared bathroom. The water pressure was weak, but at least it was hot. I stood there for a while, letting the steam fill the small room. I tried to push the disturbing thoughts away. Then I dried off, got dressed, and went back to my room. The hallway was silent. I felt relieved, but also tense, as if I were waiting for something to happen. I sat on my bed playing with my cell phone, checking messages and reading the news. Nothing interesting. Time seemed to pass very slowly. Around 11 p.m., I started to feel sleepy. I considered leaving the lights on all night, but the glow was too bright, and I figured it would keep me awake anyway. I turned off the main light but left the night lamp on. I stretched out on the bed, on top of the blankets. Every little noise made me tremble. The wind against the window, the creaking of the walls. My own breathing seemed too loud. The hours passed. I looked at my cell phone again. It was around 2 a.m. My eyelids were getting heavy. I began to doze off, and then I heard it. Footsteps in the hallway. It was the same heavy footsteps moving from one end to the other. My heart raced. My mouth felt dry. I sat up, swinging my legs off the bed. I stared at the door, waiting to see if it would happen again. The footsteps came closer, stopped, and then receded. I got up, tiptoed to the door, and pressed my ear against it. My heart was pounding in my ears. The hallway was silent for a few seconds. Then the footsteps started again, right outside. The handle moved slightly once. I heard a soft click. I felt a rush of adrenaline. My scalp tingled. I turned the lock on my side, but the door continued to shake, as if someone was trying to open it. Then everything went silent. I moved away from the door, grabbing my cell phone. My hands were shaking. I decided that enough was enough. I grabbed my jacket, and slowly opened the door, ready to face whoever was out there. The hallway lights were dim. I didn't see anything. All the doors were closed and the hallway was empty. There was no noise, no movement. The place seemed completely paralyzed. I walked down the hallway, checking every corner. I looked in the lobby, the lights were off, and there was no sign of the landlord. The entire building was silent. I went back to my room, locked the door, and sat down on the bed, breathing heavily. My stomach was in knots. I was sweating. I couldn't think straight. I didn't know what else to do, so I stayed there, fully clothed, with the lamp on for the rest of the night. I didn't hear any more footsteps. My eyes kept returning to the window, hoping to see a silhouette there again. I felt as if someone was waiting outside my door. I stared at the clock on my phone, watching the minutes tick by. I felt exhausted, but I couldn't sleep. Every little noise made me jump. When the first rays of light began to appear through the window, I breathed a little easier. I could hear birds outside, which somehow made everything seem normal again. I quickly packed my suitcase and walked to the lobby. I ran into the owner carrying a carton of eggs from the kitchen. He nodded at me, but I didn't bother to ask for breakfast. I just thanked him for the room and told him I had to go check on my car. He smiled politely, but he must have noticed how nervous I was. This time I didn't mention the footsteps or the figure in the window. It didn't matter. I just wanted to leave. I put my things in the car and drove off, hoping the mechanic would have good news. My head felt heavy and my eyes burned from lack of sleep. I kept looking in the rearview mirror, hoping to see someone in the back seat. I was sure there was something else in that apartment with me, but I couldn't explain it. I never found out who or what was walking through those hallways at 3 a.m., and I never found out who was at my window. All I know is that I stayed awake the rest of that second night, my heart racing, convinced I wasn't alone. Next story. I still remember the day I first saw the place. It looked huge, and I was proud to have finally found a spacious townhouse. The previous owner showed me around, showing me the living room, the kitchen, the bedrooms, and everything else. But there was one room upstairs that was locked. He didn't bother to explain much, just said, "That one's off limits. I don't give you permission to do anything in there." I didn't push it. I was too excited about moving to worry about a single locked room, but it stuck in my mind. It was like a little puzzle I wasn't allowed to solve. I'm not superstitious. I don't go looking for secrets. Still, I couldn't ignore the idea that there was a space in my new home that I couldn't access. The first night after I moved in, I was busy organizing boxes in the hallway. I passed that door several times. It was locked with a simple lock. Through the crack at the bottom, I could see a little darkness, nothing special, but my curiosity was growing. I knelt down, put my eye to the keyhole and tried to see inside. I didn't see much. I could make out the shape of a bed, perhaps some furniture covered with sheets. The flashlight on my phone didn't reach that far. The door was solid. I felt a little silly spying on a room like that, so I got up and told myself I'd leave it alone. The landlord had told me not to touch it, and I had no intention of risking my lease during the first few weeks. For the first few weeks, I completely forgot about the room. I had boxes to unpack, shelves to assemble, and a bunch of chores to do. Work was busy, and I spent more time out than in. When I was home, I was either sleeping or organizing. At night, I would occasionally pass by that closed door on my way to the bathroom, but it seemed normal. No noises, no strange sensations, just a closed door. Then, towards the end of the second week, I was in bed one night, looking at my phone before going to sleep, and I heard what sounded like a slight rattling. It was faint. I wasn't even sure I heard it at first, so I paused and listened. It was coming from the hallway. It was the doorknob on that closed door. My heart raced a little. I thought maybe there was a draft or something pushing it, but there were no open windows in that hallway. The rest of the house was silent. I walked over, pressed my ear against the door and waited. No sound, no movement. I shrugged it off. I thought maybe the house was settling or the latch was loose. I went back to bed. A few nights later, I heard it again. This time it was a more distinct noise, as if someone was trying to turn the knob from the inside. My hand grew cold. I started to sweat a little on my forehead. I turned on the hallway light and stared at the door. The noise stopped immediately. I went over and turned the knob myself. It was still locked. I leaned in. Nothing for a minute. I considered calling the landlord to ask, but it was late and I felt silly. I went back to my room, closed the door, and tried to sleep, but it took a while to calm down. One Sunday afternoon, things escalated. I was in the living room, relaxing on the sofa. The television was on low. It was clear outside, a quiet day. Then, suddenly, I heard a noise coming from upstairs. This time it wasn't just a handle rattling. It sounded like something heavy dragging across the floor, long scrapes across the wood. I froze. My first thought was that someone had broken into the house, but I had locked the front door and all the windows. I turned off the TV and listened carefully. The noise continued for several seconds, slow, deliberate scrapes. My chest tightened. I was scared, I admit it. I'm not used to strange noises in my house, especially in a locked room. I grabbed a small crowbar that I keep under the sofa. My hands were shaking. I slowly climbed the stairs, sticking close to the wall. My breathing was uneven and my heart was pounding in my ears. When I reached the hallway, everything went silent again. I stood there for a moment, thinking that maybe I should call the police, but the door was still the same, closed, no signs of being forced, no footprints on the floor, no marks around the doorknob. I pressed my ear against the wood. It was so quiet that I could hear my heart beating in my head. Then I heard a faint step inside, a single creak. I jumped back, feeling a rush of adrenaline. The hairs on my arms stood on end. I grabbed the handle but didn't dare try to break down the door. Something inside me told me it was a bad idea. I backed away and went back downstairs. I sat on the sofa, my heart racing, but I didn't hear anything else for the rest of the day. Still, I remained alert, glancing at the stairs every few minutes. I couldn't concentrate on anything else. My stomach was churning. It felt like I was waiting for something else to happen, but the afternoon and evening passed without further noise. When I tried to sleep that night, I lay awake for hours, listening to every little creak or click in the house, convinced that something might move behind that door again. Over the next few days, my tension remained high. I felt nervous every time I went upstairs. I expected to hear a shuffling or a bang. Sometimes I would stand in front of the locked room just staring at it. I thought of all kinds of explanations. Maybe the owner kept some old machinery in there, or maybe there was an animal trapped inside. But I kept coming back to the same memory. I had looked through the keyhole before. There was a bed and some furniture covered with sheets, but there didn't seem to be anything that could move on its own. Finally, one night I snapped when I heard my name. I was almost asleep. My bedroom door was slightly open, and the hallway light was off. I heard it so clearly. "Eric," a whisper coming from the locked room. I sat up in bed with a start, my heart pounding. I grabbed my cell phone and turned on the flashlight. I didn't get up right away. I just pointed the light at my bedroom door and waited. I waited. I stayed like that for a long time, not breathing very loudly, hoping I wouldn't hear anything else. But I didn't hear anything else. Finally, I forced myself to close the door and lock it. I slept with my phone in my hand. The next morning, my neck was stiff from being so tense all night. At that moment, I decided that I wasn't going to live in fear of a locked room. I remembered that I had a set of master keys in a tool bag I keep in the garage. It's not a sophisticated set, but it had worked before for opening old locks. The next day, I grabbed the kit, went upstairs, and looked at the doorknob. My stomach churned. My palms were sweaty. I kept telling myself I would do it quickly. I inserted the tools into the lock and took a deep breath. It felt like I was doing something forbidden, but I couldn't go on without answers. It took several attempts before the lock clicked. When it finally turned, I felt a rush of anticipation. I grabbed the knob and slowly pushed the door open. The hinges creaked. The room was dark because the blinds were closed. I turned on the ceiling light, which worked. The first thing I noticed was the cold. It hit me like walking into a freezer. My skin prickled. I was breathing heavily. The bed was covered with a dusty sheet. There was a nightstand, a dresser, and a chair, all covered with old fabric. The floor was wood and smelled a little damp. The air felt heavy, as if it hadn't moved in years. I entered carefully, dodging random boxes. I saw a table lamp on the side table. I reached out and touched the bedpost. It was freezing cold. My fingertips burned. I couldn't understand why it was so cold in there. It was summer and the rest of the house was warm. I checked the windows. They were closed and locked from the inside. I ran my hand over one of the sheets covering the furniture. It was damp, or maybe just cold from condensation. Either way, it left a strange feeling on my skin. Then nausea washed over me. My stomach churned and I felt like I was going to throw up. My head spun. My vision blurred for a second. I had to lean against the dresser. I was breathing heavily. I don't normally get nauseous, so it was alarming. I felt a sudden wave of panic, turned around and headed for the door. I staggered back into the hallway and closed the door behind me, leaving it unlocked. I knelt on the floor, breathing heavily, trying not to throw up. My shirt was damp with sweat. After a minute or so, I felt a little better, but my heart was still racing. I locked the door again from the outside, as if that would keep whatever was inside from getting out. I went downstairs and tried to calm down. My head was pounding. I drank some water and sat down at the kitchen table. My hands were still shaking. I couldn't believe how cold that room was, and that smell, and the damp fabric, none of it made sense. The rest of the house was at a normal temperature. The sun was shining outside, but upstairs it felt like a refrigerator. I realized I hadn't seen any ventilation or anything that could explain it. I looked at the clock. It was mid-afternoon, but I felt exhausted, as if I had run a marathon. Since then, I can't walk down that hallway without my nerves on edge. I keep looking at that door, remembering how I felt in there. It's hard to describe the panic. It's not just fear. It's more like my body is reacting to something it can't process. My shoulders tense up, my eyes fill with tears, and my skin gets clammy every time I'm near that locked room. Sometimes, when I'm in the bathroom with the door open, I think I hear a slight scratch or noise coming from inside that forbidden space. My name too, whispered at random moments late at night when I'm half asleep. I catch myself focusing on every sound, wondering if I'll hear it again. I haven't told the landlord. He told me not to touch anything, and I'm sure I broke the agreement when I opened that lock. But I can't see myself sleeping peacefully without knowing what's going on in there. I've searched the internet to see if there could be some kind of air leak causing temperature drops, or if maybe there's an old pipe making noise, but none of that explains the footsteps or the sound of something heavy being dragged. And nothing explains my name being spoken. Now, every night, I debate whether to open that door again. Maybe I should install a camera or a recording device inside to see what's going on, but I'm afraid of what I might find. I don't want to go back into that freezing air, feeling nauseous and on the verge of panic. The memory of that cold is still fresh in my mind, and I have a feeling that if I go back in there, something worse might happen. I'm still living here. I haven't broken the lease or packed my bags. Maybe it's stubbornness. Maybe it's because everything else about the place is great. I love the big kitchen and the high ceilings. I like my room, which has a beautiful view from the balcony. But that room is always in the back of my mind. Sometimes I think about hiring someone to check it out, but I can't imagine explaining the situation to a contractor or handyman. Hey, I have a locked room that feels like a refrigerator. and sometimes I hear strange noises coming from inside, including my name being whispered. Would you mind taking a look? They'd think I'm crazy or charge me a fortune. I've tried to ignore it. I really have. For a few days, I left the hallway light on at night so I wouldn't be so scared to walk by. But the idea that there might be something moving inside didn't go away. My sleep got worse. I wake up tired, and I'm more irritable. I'm nervous at work. I come home expecting to find the door open or something, but it's always closed, locked, just as I left it. Every now and then, I still hear the doorknob moving. I'm in the kitchen washing the dishes, and I hear a slight metallic noise. I turn off the tap, hold my breath, and listen. It always stops when I move. Sometimes I've pressed my ear against the door again, and I could swear I hear breathing or some kind of soft movement inside. It gives me the creeps. My scalp tingles. My heart starts racing. I've also started getting headaches. They appear when I'm near the door. I've noticed a pattern. The closer I get, the more pressure I feel in my temples. When I go back downstairs, it disappears. I've tried opening a window in the hallway to let in some fresh air. Nothing has changed. That room is still cold and sealed, and I'm still anxious. I'm at a point where I don't know what to do next. I can't go on living like this forever, but I'm not ready to give up the house. It's a nice place, except for that damn room. Sometimes I think about just opening it up again in the middle of the day, turning on all the lights and ripping those sheets off the furniture to see what's underneath. Maybe I'd find something ordinary, a broken bed frame or some old trunks, but I can't shake the fear that there's something else, something that doesn't make sense in a normal way. Now I keep the door locked and hide the key in a drawer in my room. Sometimes I look at it, wondering if I should destroy it or return it to the landlord, but I can't bring myself to do either. So I'm stuck in this strange limbo, living in a house with a room that seems to be alive in a nasty way. My name, the creaking noises, the moving doorknob, the icy air, the nausea, it's all become part of my daily life. That's where I am. I'm just trying to deal with it. I'm thinking about installing a new lock on that door, maybe something more secure. But then again, the noise could still be there. There's no guarantee that it will stop anything. I don't know what's inside that room or why it feels so bad, but I know I don't like it, and every time I walk by, my stomach churns and I hurry away. The tension is constant, and I've never felt anything like it before. I wonder if I'll ever get used to it. I wonder if it will get worse. Right now, all I can do is wait and see what happens, and every night I brace myself for that whisper. Eric. Next story. I felt my heart race the moment I walked into the clinic that Saturday night. It was around 5 p.m. and the sun was already setting. I immediately noticed that something seemed strange. The clinic was always quiet on weekends, but that day the silence seemed heavier than usual. The lights in the hallway were on at half strength, and everything seemed very still. My name is Daniel, and I work as an administrative assistant at a medical clinic. We are closed on weekends, but I had a lot of paperwork to organize before Monday. Our management software had messed up some patient records, and I needed to find physical copies to verify everything. My boss told me I could stay late during the week, but I thought it would be easier to come in on Saturday when no one else was around. I figured I'd get through the pile of papers faster if I could concentrate without interruptions. The day started off normally. I used my key to get in, turned on the lights I needed, and headed to my small office near the reception desk. The clinic has a main hallway with 3 exam rooms, a small lab area, a storage room, and an office for the doctors. The reception desk is at the front, just behind a glass window with a sliding screen. My small office is next door, near the manager's office. It's a modest space with a computer, a filing cabinet, and a desk that barely fits my chair, and a small bookcase. I started pulling out the files of patients I needed to cross-check with the digital records. There were maybe 50 or 60 folders, each filled with forms and test results. I spent a few hours cross-checking the documents, making sure that the addresses, phone numbers, and medical notes matched what we had in the computer system. It was boring work, but I'd done it hundreds of times before. Everything was quiet. There was little more than the hum of the fluorescent lights and the rustling of paper. Around 7, I decided to take a break. I'd brought a sandwich in a small cooler, so I went to the break room behind the front desk. That's when I realized how quiet the clinic was. Normally there's some background noise, like the ventilation system or a small refrigerator in the break room. But that day, it seemed like everything was muffled. I thought it was just me getting nervous because I'm not used to being there alone on a Saturday. I shrugged, heated my sandwich for a few seconds in the microwave, and sat down at one of the small tables. The light in the break room flickered once, but I'd seen that before. It's just an old light bulb, so I didn't pay any attention to it. I finished my sandwich in about 5 minutes, washed my hands in the small sink, and went back to work. I sat down at my desk and continued going through the folders. I tried to be systematic. Check the name, check the date of birth, check the notes, confirm that everything matched, move on. I got into a good rhythm and lost track of time. At some point, I realized it was almost 8:30, so I got up to stretch my legs. I walked down the hallway and turned on more lights so I wouldn't have to move around in the dark. That's when the first strange thing happened. The lights in the main hallway flickered, not just once, but in sequence like a quick flicker, then a pause, then another flicker. It reminded me of a power surge. It only lasted a second or two. I frowned, looked at the switches, and wondered if there was an electrical problem in the building. But just then, I heard a scratching noise, like someone dragging a chair across the floor. It was coming from the study at the end of the hallway. The sound made my hair stand on end because it was so distinctive. I had moved tables in those rooms before, and they always made that muffled squeak on the tile floor. I walked toward the exam room with my heart pounding. I tried to breathe normally, but my chest felt tight. The door was closed. I remembered locking it in the afternoon because I always locked the examination rooms when there were no doctors around. But now the door was open a few inches. It wasn't completely open, but it definitely wasn't locked or even closed. I pushed it with my foot, hoping to see something out of place. Maybe a stool with wheels had been moved, or maybe a table had been moved, but the room looked normal. The examination table was in its usual place. The chairs were lined up against the wall, the ceiling light was off, and the countertops were empty except for a blood pressure cuff and some gloves. It smelled like disinfectant, as always. I went in, turned on the light, and scanned the room. Nothing seemed to have been moved. There were no footprints, no sign of anyone else nearby. I tried to convince myself that I had just forgotten to lock the door, that maybe I had been distracted, but I was sure I had locked all the exam rooms earlier that day. I did a quick check, turning the latch back and forth. It seemed to be working fine. I turned off the light and closed the door again, making sure it clicked. I went back to my desk, but I felt uneasy. I tried to keep working, but my thoughts kept returning to the noise I had heard. It wasn't my imagination. I knew the sound of something heavy sliding across the floor. It was too clear to ignore. I shook my head and forced myself to keep reviewing files. I glanced at the clock. It was almost 9. I had an hour or two left before I had to leave, so I needed to focus. Then, maybe 10 minutes later, I heard footsteps in the reception area. At first I thought it was my imagination, but the sound was different. Slow footsteps on the tile floor, as if someone was walking carefully. I froze in my chair, holding my breath. The footsteps seemed to be heading toward my office door. I stared at the doorknob, waiting for it to turn, but nothing happened. The footsteps stopped. I stood up, pushed my chair back, and opened the door slightly. There was no one there. The hallway was empty, the reception desk looked untouched, and the lights were on. I went out trying to stay calm. My throat was dry and I could hear my own pulse in my ears. I looked around. Everything seemed the same, except that I realized the front door was still locked from the inside, just as I had left it. I couldn't think of any reason for those footsteps. I started to wonder if maybe someone had come in while I was in the back, but how? The door needs a key, and we have security cameras in the hallway, although they're mainly decorative. I told myself I was imagining things. Maybe it was my own footsteps echoing, or maybe the building was creaking. I tried to get back to my paperwork. I told myself I'd be out of there soon, and that I really wanted to finish the job, but my nerves were on edge. Every little noise made me jump. The hum of the ventilation ducts, the ticking of the wall clock, the faint buzz of my computer monitor. I felt sweat on my forehead and my hands were clammy. About 15 minutes later, the lights flickered again. This time there was a brief wobble followed by a click. One of the hallway lights went out completely, leaving a dark stretch near the entrance. The rest remained on, but they seemed dimmer. I tried to stay calm and got up to check the switch panel in the storage room. Everything seemed normal. None of the switches had tripped. I touched a few just to be sure. No change. The hallway light was still out. As I stood there in the storage room, I heard something again in the reception area. It was a soft, shuffling sound, as if someone was shifting position on the floor. I stepped out of the storage room and called out, "Hello? Is anyone there?" My voice echoed down the hallway. There was no answer. I walked slowly toward the reception desk. The only movement I saw was the shadow cast by the dimly lit lights. I looked over the counter. Nothing. The reception computer screen was off and all the drawers were closed. The chairs in the waiting room were lined up as usual and the front door was locked. I remember feeling shaky at that moment. My stomach was tense and I had a growing sense of panic. I told myself I should leave, but then I looked at the file box on my desk. I really wanted to finish. It was half pride and half stupidity. I decided to give it one more try. Maybe I was nervous because it was late and I was alone in a place that is usually full of people. I went back to my office, sat down, and picked up the top folder. My leg was restless under the table. I looked at the records, but I had lost my concentration. That's when I saw it, a shadow moving outside my door, passing from left to right, faint against the glass. It was a brief shape, like a person walking. My heart leapt. I threw the folder on the desk and ran to the door, throwing it open. The hallway was empty again, but this time I noticed something new. The door to the exam room at the end of the hallway, the same one I had closed earlier, was slightly ajar again. My pulse was pounding in my temples. I didn't want to go check, but I couldn't ignore it. I walked toward it, my sneakers squeaking on the tile. The hallway seemed colder than before. When I reached the door, I found it open about an inch. I pushed it slowly and turned on the light. The room looked exactly the same as before. The chairs were still lined up, the exam table was clean, and nothing was out of place. I checked the window. It was locked from the inside. There were no signs that anyone had forced their way in. I turned off the light and backed away, closing the door behind me. This time I tried the handle several times, pushing the door to make sure the latch clicked into place. It closed with a click, and I tried to open it without turning the handle. It remained locked. I stood there for a moment, listening to my own breathing. I noticed a slight tremor in my hands. Suddenly, I heard a loud thud in the main hallway. It sounded like something heavy had fallen to the floor. I ran to look, but everything was in its place. The chairs in the waiting room, the reception desk, the trash can, everything normal. I was done. My nerves were shot. I decided I wasn't staying there any longer. That last noise convinced me. I went back to my office, turned off my computer, and stacked the folders carelessly. I wanted out. My heart was pounding, and I felt a chill in my arms. I could barely think straight, but I managed to close my desk drawers and grab my coat. I walked toward the front door, looking over my shoulder every few steps. I didn't see anything or anyone, but I felt like I was being watched. I opened the front door and stepped out into the cold night air. The sky was completely dark at that hour, and the parking lot was empty except for my car. I closed the door behind me, locked it, and practically ran to my car. My hands were shaking so much that I almost dropped my keys. Once inside, I locked the doors immediately and started the engine. As I drove away, I glanced at the clinic windows. All the lights were still on, except for the broken light in the hallway. I stared at the building for a moment, my breathing uneven and sweat forming under my shirt. I didn't see any movement inside, but I didn't want to stay long enough to find out if anything else would happen. I got home and tried to calm down, but my mind kept replaying those noises in the shadow. I kept thinking about how the door was open again, even though I was sure I had locked it. The following Monday, I went to work as usual. I didn't tell anyone what had happened. I was afraid they would think I was making it up, or that I had just been scared by a flickering light. But part of me is still convinced that there was something else there that night. I haven't been back to the clinic alone on weekends since then. If I have extra work, I do it during the week or take it home with me. I always feel a little rush of tension when I walk past that examination room. Sometimes I notice that the door is open when it should be closed, or I hear a little creak when I'm alone at the end of the day. I force myself to ignore it, but I still feel a knot in my stomach every time. I didn't see anyone face to face that night, but I know I heard footsteps. I know I saw that shadow, and I know that the door didn't stay closed like it should have. The memory of those flashing lights and the scraping noise still makes my hair stand on end, even now. If someone asks me to stay late at the clinic alone, I look for an excuse. I can't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone there, even though I didn't see a soul. Next story. I entered the library basement that night with a feeling of stiffness in my shoulders and a slight tremor in my hands. I didn't believe in hidden voices or strange movements before I started working here. I liked books. I liked their smell and the feeling of calm they gave me, but I'd never heard whispers in empty corridors until I started this job. Now, I can't get those sounds out of my head. I work in an old university library. It has classic wooden shelves, heavy tables, and thick carpeting on most floors. The building seems formal during the day. Students come in, study for hours, and leave. Professors wander around, consult references, and talk in low voices. The employees have their routines, returning books, organizing carts, repairing old volumes, and answering questions at the front desk. During normal hours, everything seems normal. Things change at night, especially in the basement. It's cold down there. The air smells of mold and dampness. The lighting is dim. Most of the lamps are old, so they sometimes flicker and cause shadows to dance across the walls. No one stays near the basement unless they have to, because the place is mainly used for storing research books. Students rarely venture into that section, preferring the modern references on the upper floor. So usually, it's just me organizing shelves, taking inventory, and pulling out old books for minor repairs. I remember the first time I noticed something strange. I was putting away some old magazines in the far corner of the basement. The hallway is narrow and the shelves are tall. I was stacking volumes in alphabetical order. I heard a dull noise, almost like two people whispering. It wasn't the usual hum of the ventilation ducts or the creaking of old pipes. It sounded like words. I couldn't make out what they were saying, but I could have sworn I heard syllables. I stopped moving books, held my breath, and tried to listen. I heard soft whispers and short pauses, like when conversations are interrupted every few words. My arms tensed. I turned around, looked down the row of shelves, and saw nothing. I thought maybe a coworker was talking on the other side. I walked to the corner, but it was empty. I decided that maybe I had imagined it. I had had a long shift, and my mind sometimes plays tricks on me when I'm tired. I went back to the cart and continued putting away books. That whisper continued on random nights. It would appear for a moment, and then disappear. I started checking more carefully every time I heard it. I would quickly turn corners, shine my small flashlight under the shelves, or call out to see if anyone was there. Each time, the sound would stop. Each time, I found no one. I even asked a coworker if the basement had any strange acoustics, as if I might be hearing a conversation from the floor above echoing through the ventilation ducts. He shrugged and said he'd never heard anything. He seemed sincere. That left me with no explanation. One night, I stayed later than usual. The library was almost empty. It was almost midnight. I had a short list of tasks to complete. Finish an inventory of old reference books, check some damaged spines, and lock up a storage room in the back. Sometimes I liked working alone because it was quiet. I could concentrate on each book, note its condition, and move on. But that night, I felt nervous for no apparent reason. The silence made my hair stand on end. Around 11:30 p.m., I heard a thud in a nearby hallway. I thought maybe a book had fallen off a cart. I put down my clipboard and went to see if anything had fallen. When I got closer, I saw a heavy black book lying on the floor near the bottom of a tall bookcase. Nothing else seemed out of place. I picked it up and noticed that the leather cover was cold. My pulse quickened. The ceiling light above the bookcase flickered several times. I looked up, wondering if maybe the light bulb was burning out. Then I noticed the gap where the book must have come from. It was about 3 rows up. There was no cart, and I hadn't put anything there that night. I looked around to see if anyone was nearby. There was no one. I could feel my heart pounding in my ears. I wondered if the shelf was slanted, but it seemed stable. I thought of old wood or a slanted board, but I didn't see any slant. I opened the cover. There was a library stamp from decades ago. The pages smelled moldy. I saw some notes that looked old. Nothing made sense to me. It was cramped writing in the margins, symbols and short words that didn't form sentences. I tried to read the scribbles, but gave up after a few seconds. Then, right behind me, I felt a slight draft. It brushed against my neck, and I felt the hairs on my arms stand on end. I turned quickly, expecting to see someone leaning over my shoulder. I was alone. A lump formed in my throat. I closed the book and tried to stay calm. I put it back on the shelf, but I couldn't stop thinking about how I had heard that noise and seen that book on the floor. I couldn't find any logical explanation for it. I returned to my desk in the corner of the basement and tried to finish my inventory. My mind couldn't concentrate. I kept looking over my shoulder every few seconds. I felt as if someone was watching me. The same feeling you get when someone is behind you in a line. My heart was still racing, and I kept rubbing the back of my neck to see if there was a cold spot or any strange change in temperature. The ceiling lights flickered again. They stabilized after a few moments, but I was uneasy. Half an hour later, I heard that whisper again. This time, it was much clearer. 2 different voices whispering at the same time. They sounded close, maybe 2 or 3 rows away. I got up slowly, trying not to make a sound. I wanted to surprise whoever was there. I walked toward the sound, my footsteps soft on the concrete floor. The whispering continued. It didn't sound excited or angry, just like 2 people having a quiet conversation. Then I reached the end of the row, turned around, and saw nothing. The whispering stopped. My chest felt tight. I took a small flashlight from my belt and looked down the hallway. All I saw were shelves, books, and some loose papers on one of the carts. There was no one there. My breathing was ragged. My right hand started to shake, and I realized I was gripping the flashlight so tightly that my knuckles were white. I needed a break. I left the basement for a few minutes. I went up to the main floor and looked for another employee. There was no one at the front desk. I remembered that the main desk closes early on some days, so I walked to a side hallway where the employee break room is located. I found a coworker there drinking coffee from a paper cup. He was reading something on his cell phone. I asked him if he had been in the basement recently. He shook his head. I asked him if he had heard anything strange. He said no. I felt silly for pursuing the matter, so I let it go. I just told him my shift was almost over. He nodded and wished me a quiet night. I went back to the basement. I sat down at my small metal table and forced myself to resume my work. I didn't want to stay there all night. I had about 10 more books to check into the inventory. I tried not to think about the whispers. I tried to focus on the shape of the books, the condition of the spines, and the call numbers on the covers. When I was done, I stacked the last volumes on a return cart and stood up. I felt that presence behind me again, as if someone were leaning over me. My body reacted before I could think. I turned around with the flashlight held high. The light swept across the old shelves and dusty floors. I didn't see a single figure. My throat was dry. My mouth tasted like adrenaline. I told myself to calm down. I knew that if I lost my composure, I would end up running out of there. I just wanted to lock up and leave. I decided to walk through the aisles one last time to make sure everything was in order. I recharged my flashlight and walked carefully, examining each row. The shelves looked normal. No books were out of place. The floor was clean. I turned off some table lamps and locked the back storage room. I was about to go upstairs when I heard a loud crack. I froze, thinking it was a door. I pointed the flashlight toward the noise. It was coming from a bookshelf near the far wall. I stood still for a moment, waiting. The bookshelf looked sturdy. It wasn't moving. I waited for another noise, but it didn't come. After a few seconds, I forced myself to continue. At the top of the stairs, as I turned off the basement lights with the wall switch, I felt relieved to be out of that cold space. I closed the basement door and stepped out into the night. I couldn't sleep well. I kept thinking I heard footsteps in my apartment. Every creak in the floor made me sit up in bed. The next day at work, I felt nervous and tired. I stayed on the main floor as long as I could. I had some tasks to do upstairs, such as helping with a new shipment of textbooks. I avoided going down to the basement until late afternoon. However, in the end, I had to take some volumes that belonged to the old archive. My stomach was in knots the whole time. When I got out of the elevator in the basement, I noticed that the lights were still flickering a little. I heard the hum of the ventilation system. There was no one else around. I took the books to the shelf where they belonged. I kept looking behind me, worried that I would hear those whispers again. Everything remained silent. I quickly put the books away and tried to leave. On my way to the exit, I saw that black book again. It was in the same place on the shelf, about 3 rows up. I felt a sudden chill. I leaned over to check, half expecting it to move or slide. It stayed where it was. I touched the spine. The leather was cold. I took it out again and opened it to the page with the strange notes. My eyes scanned the scribbles. It looked like someone had written random characters in pencil. I saw some lines crossed out. I didn't see any pattern. It made no sense to me. I closed the book, put it back in its place, and left. I told myself not to think about it too much, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Over the next few days, the whispers continued. They never lasted long enough for me to make out what they were saying. Sometimes they sounded like they were right behind me. Other times, they were faint, as if coming from across the room. I began to dread my shifts. I took every opportunity to work upstairs. I did my best to stay out of the basement whenever I could. One night, however, I had no choice. A professor requested a rare magazine from the archives. I had to go down and retrieve it before the next morning. The basement was empty again. I searched for the magazine on the shelves. My hands trembled slightly as I leafed through the older volumes. The pages felt fragile under my fingers. The beam of light from my flashlight illuminated dust particles floating in the air. The ceiling light seemed dimmer than usual. I caught that soft whisper at the edge of my ear. At first it was far away, but it grew closer. I swallowed hard and called out, "Hello?" My voice echoed. The whisper stopped, then started again. It made my heart race. I followed the sound, shining my flashlight ahead of me. The hallway ended in a row of locked cabinets. There was nothing there. The sound stopped again. A book fell to the floor behind me. I jumped so hard I almost dropped my flashlight. I turned around and saw another volume lying face down on the floor. This time it wasn't the black book. It was a brown hardcover with gold lettering on the spine. The lights flickered again, and I felt my throat close up. I picked up the book, put it back on the shelf, and backed away. I couldn't see how it had fallen. The shelf wasn't full. There was space between the books. Nothing was pressing against it. I felt a weight on my chest and started to sweat. I decided I couldn't stand down there another minute. I didn't care if I found the professor's magazine. I walked toward the stairs, holding the flashlight with a trembling hand. When I reached the last step, I heard a single word behind me. It was a soft voice, but I couldn't make it out. It sounded like a low whisper, just one syllable. I didn't wait to see what it was. I ran up the stairs 2 at a time and out of the basement. Now I still work in the library. Sometimes I still have to go to the basement. I do what I have to do, but I don't stay there. I do my tasks quickly. I no longer investigate strange noises. When I hear whispers, I concentrate on finishing my work. My heart still races every time the lights flicker. If a book falls off a shelf, I pick it up and put it back without looking at the pages. I don't read the scribbles. I don't listen to the voices. I just want to get out of there. I don't know what causes those things. I don't talk about it much with my coworkers. I don't bring my friends here to see it. It's not something I can explain or prove. I only know what I've seen and heard. The night I felt that presence behind me, the whispers in the hallways, and the books falling for no reason, it all happened. If you ever find yourself alone in the basement of an old university library, pay attention. You may hear something you can't explain, and if you do, my only advice is, don't stay long. Next story. I moved into this house about a year ago. It's nothing fancy, just a one-story house with hardwood floors and a small basement. From the beginning, I noticed little creaks whenever the temperature changed. I thought it was normal. Wood moves, houses settle. I didn't think much of it. But then the noises got louder at night. That's when I started to feel uneasy. I wanted to ignore them, but I couldn't. It sounded like something under the floor was pushing against the boards. I started losing sleep and decided I had to find out what was going on. I remember the first time the noises really worried me. It was around midnight on a Tuesday. I was in the living room standing near the sofa when I heard a sudden crack coming from the floor. It wasn't the usual little creak. It was a sharp sound, like a board breaking. My heart started pounding. I stood there waiting for another noise, but everything was quiet. I tapped my foot on the spot, trying to see if the board felt loose. It seemed normal. I told myself it was just an old house making old house noises. A few days later, I heard something different. It sounded like a thud coming from under the floor. At first, I thought maybe a tool had fallen into the basement, so I grabbed a flashlight and went downstairs. The basement was dimly lit by a single lamp that I turned on with a chain. I looked around and didn't see anything out of place. There were a few boxes of old clothes, some broken furniture, and a small shelf with tools I rarely used. Everything seemed fine. The floor above me seemed solid. I didn't see any cracks or holes. I felt a little silly, so I went back upstairs. But the noises continued. A week later, they became more frequent. Every night, around 11 or later, I would hear a new series of bangs or creaks. Sometimes they were soft and spaced out. Other times they were sharper, almost rhythmic, as if something down there was testing the boards. I kept trying to ignore it, but it was impossible to relax. My living room was small, and the wooden floor seemed to be constantly moving beneath my feet. I began to notice that if I moved to a corner of the room, the noise would stop for a few seconds, as if something sensed my presence. I would move away, and the noise would start again. I began to worry about structural problems. I'm no expert, but I know that if the foundation shifts, you can hear strange noises like creaking. So I called a friend who is good at home repairs. He came over on a Saturday afternoon. We walked around the house together. He knocked on the walls, measured a few things in the basement. He said everything seemed fine structurally. He told me that old houses sometimes do that. Then he left, and I was alone again. That night, I was sitting on my couch watching TV with the volume low. I fell asleep. I woke up around 2 a.m. and realized the TV was still on. I heard a soft thumping under my feet, sounding like someone was gently tapping on the wood from below. The living room was dark except for the glow from the TV. I felt my muscles tense and my stomach tighten. I leaned forward and put my hand on the floor. I felt a slight vibration, like a faint tremor. My heart began to pound. It seemed like something was moving under the house, but the basement was just an empty space with boxes. I got up, grabbed a flashlight, and went downstairs. My footsteps on the wooden steps echoed in the silent house. The basement was calm, the air cold and still. I shone the flashlight beam across the floor beams and walls. There were cobwebs in the corners, a few nails stuck in the wooden beams, and some old storage boxes. Nothing seemed disturbed. There were no animals or open holes. I stood there for a while, trying to pick up any movement or sound. Everything was silent. When I went back upstairs, I felt a strange heaviness in my chest. I couldn't explain it. I just felt uneasy. I closed the basement door and went to my room, but I couldn't sleep. My mind kept returning to that knocking sound. Around 4 a.m., I finally fell asleep. Over the next few days, I tried to keep myself busy. I went to work, went to the movies with a friend, and spent less time at home. But every time I came back, I had to walk through that same room. The floor seemed hostile. I started wearing slippers, even though I usually walked barefoot. I no longer liked the feel of the wood under my feet. It was as if I were stepping on something alive. A few nights later, the noises increased. Around midnight, I heard a series of sharp clicks in quick succession. It was almost as if someone was banging their fist on the underside of the floorboards. I jumped up from the sofa and stood in the middle of the room, not knowing what to do. My breathing was uneven, and I could feel sweat forming on my forehead. I thought about calling the police, but what would I say? There were no signs of a break-in, no voices or anything like that. It was just those thumps under the floor. I decided to document it. I grabbed my phone and started recording. I walked around the living room with the microphone pointed at the floor. I heard the thumps with my own ears, but when I played back the recording, all I could hear was a faint static hiss. There were no thumps. I tried again in different spots, with the same result. I could hear it clearly in real life, but the phone wasn't picking up anything. I felt frustrated and a little scared. It made me question my own senses, even though the sounds were too clear to be my imagination. I crouched down and put my ear to the floor. I heard a slow, steady noise, like breathing. It wasn't my own breathing. I held my breath to be sure. There was a soft inhalation and exhalation coming through the wood. My scalp tingled and I felt a wave of heat spread across my face. My mind went blank. I stood there for several seconds, listening. Then I heard a low snoring sound, almost like a growl, and I backed away quickly. I got up quickly and went to the kitchen. I filled a glass with water and tried to calm down. My hand was shaking, so I held onto the edge of the sink to steady myself. I spent the next day at work trying to forget about it, but when I got home that night, I felt the panic rising. The sun was setting, and I knew I would have to face the noises again. Around 9 o'clock, I heard the first crack. It was the usual sound. Then, at 10, a few more bangs. By 11, I was tense and nervous, waiting for something louder, but nothing happened. I felt a little relieved. I went to bed around midnight, expecting the banging to start when I turned off the lights, but everything remained silent. I thought maybe it was all over. The next night, I was in bed again, reading a book. I heard a sudden series of loud bangs. They came directly from under my bedroom, which is next to the living room. I froze. My pulse raced and my mouth went dry. I forced myself to go and look. I grabbed my phone to shine some light, went into the living room, and pointed the light at the floor. Nothing seemed out of place, but I felt small vibrations under my feet, almost imperceptible. I knelt down and put my ear back to the floor. I heard something scratching. It sounded like nails or maybe claws. I don't know. My throat tightened and I pulled my head away. I thought about calling someone to come over, but it was late. I felt silly. No one would believe me without proof. I decided to take another look in the basement. This time, I grabbed a more powerful flashlight and a small crowbar, just in case. The basement light buzzed when I turned it on. The concrete floor was cold under my sneakers. I examined every corner, every box. I knocked on the walls. I stared at the space where the floor joists met the crossbeams. I stood there, my heart racing, waiting for something to happen, but everything was completely silent. Finally, I went back upstairs. I couldn't sleep in my room that night. I grabbed some blankets and stayed on the living room couch. I wanted to be close to the noise in case it started again. I kept my phone nearby. I tried to stay awake, but I fell asleep around 3 a.m. I woke up with a vibrating sensation. It was as if something was buzzing under the floor, almost like an engine running in a distant room. I sat up. My muscles were stiff from sleeping on the sofa. I pressed my bare foot against the wooden floorboards. They were shaking slightly, like a mild tremor. Then the buzzing stopped. My ears were ringing. I felt the hairs on my neck stand on end. For a moment, I sat there, not knowing what to do. My mind was filled with thoughts about what could be causing it. Maybe there was some kind of machine or generator in the neighborhood. Maybe there was a problem with the pipes. But none of that explained the breathing sounds or the loud banging. I wrapped myself in the blanket and lay still. My heart wouldn't calm down, and my mouth tasted bitter with adrenaline. Finally, I went back to sleep. The next morning, I woke up late, feeling exhausted. My back hurt, and my head was throbbing. I looked at the floor and didn't feel safe walking on it. I went to the kitchen and made coffee. The house was silent in the daylight, as if nothing had happened. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong under those boards. I tried to think of a logical explanation, but nothing came to mind. Later, I called another friend who used to work in construction. He said he couldn't come over for a while, but he'd take a look when he could. I didn't want to wait, but I had no choice. That night, I decided to try recording the audio again, but this time with an old digital recorder I found in a drawer. I tested it by talking into it, and it worked fine. Around 9 o'clock, the usual creaking noises began. I placed the recorder on the floor and waited. I heard muffled noises and clicks, and once again, that steady breathing. After a few minutes, I played back the recording, but all I could hear was static. It was the same problem I'd had with my phone. There was no real evidence. I felt a chill run through my body. It didn't make sense. I ended up sleeping in my car that night because I didn't want to stay in the house. The thought of those vibrations under my feet made me nauseous. My hands were sweating just thinking about it. I left the porch light on, locked the doors, and reclined the seat. I didn't sleep well. Every now and then, I looked at the dark windows, hoping to see something looking back at me. I felt alone and anxious, but I didn't want to call anyone and bother them with this. In the morning, I went back inside. The floor seemed the same as always. I had to get some clothes for work, so I walked carefully, stepping lightly, almost holding my breath with every step. The floorboard creaked a little under my weight. I didn't feel any vibrations. I told myself that maybe it was just a strange phenomenon that would pass, but deep down I knew I had to deal with it. That's how things are now. The house is quiet during the day, and I can almost pretend that nothing is happening, but every night the noises return. Sometimes they are soft, sometimes violent. I felt the floor shaking. I have heard what sounds like breathing or scratching coming from below. I have tried to record it, but it never appears. I've searched the basement, and there's nothing there. I don't see anything under the floor. Everything looks normal. However, every night I feel the tension rising. I don't walk barefoot anymore. I don't want to feel that sensation of something pushing up from below. I keep waiting for the moment when everything stops or something else happens. My nerves are shot. I've lost my appetite. I stare at the floor, waiting to see a board lift up on its own. I don't know what to do now. I'm thinking about staying in a motel for a while. Maybe if I leave, I'll get some peace. But then I wonder if I'll come back and find something worse. For now, I'm just enduring one night after another. I lock the basement door. I try to keep myself busy until I feel tired enough to collapse. When the noises start, I sit and listen, my heart racing and my muscles tense. I wait to see if the vibrations get louder. Sometimes they do. Sometimes they disappear. Then I get up in the morning and pretend life is normal. But it isn't. It hasn't been normal for a while, and I have no idea how to fix it. I stood at the top of the basement stairs, clutching the doorknob, and felt my hand shaking. I didn't want to go back down there, but I knew I had to finish what I started. My camera equipment was set up, the film was partially developed, and the chemicals were already mixed. I had invested too much time and money to give up. Still, my neck was stiff and my heart was pounding. I took a deep breath, opened the door, and stepped onto the first step, which creaked. I'm not a professional photographer. I'm just a guy who likes to take pictures, mostly black and white, of urban areas, old buildings, and sometimes abandoned places. I thought it would be a good idea to set up my own darkroom in the basement to save money and have some control over the developing process. I moved some boxes, blocked off a small space with plywood, and installed red safety lights and a basic ventilation system. I thought it would be easy. It wasn't. The first night I went down to develop some test photos. Everything seemed normal at first. The steps creaked as usual, and the basement smelled a little damp and moldy, which wasn't unusual. But the moment I turned on the red safety light, I felt that cold sensation on my skin, like a draft on a winter morning. The air felt thick, and I could hear the hum of the fan echoing in my ears. I shrugged it off. I told myself it was just nerves because I was new to developing film. After a few days, I started noticing little things. The lamp would flicker for a split second, even though I had changed it the day before. My tripod, which I normally kept locked against the wall, would shift an inch or two. I thought maybe I was bumping into it, but I never remembered touching it. When I tried to ignore it, I felt a knot in my stomach, as if I knew something else was going on, but didn't want to admit it. One night, I was developing a batch of photos from an abandoned train station. The water in the tank was swirling, and I was focused on the timer. Suddenly, I heard a soft click, like metal against metal. I froze. I turned my head and looked at my tripod. It was close to the corner, but it looked a little out of alignment. I stared at it, waiting to see if it would move again. Nothing happened. I felt a thumping in my ears, as if I could hear my own heartbeat in my head. I decided to call it a night. The next day, I examined my negatives. In 3 different images, I saw a faint shadow behind me. It was hard to make out, but the shape was always in the same place, slightly to the left of my shoulder. At first, I thought it was a lighting error. Then I checked everything. The lighting conditions were identical, but the shadow appeared in places where there should have been no light interference. That's when I started to feel uneasy all the time, even outside the basement. I kept looking over my shoulder, expecting to see someone there. I forced myself to keep working. I decided to develop a few more rolls. I went back downstairs, turned on the red lamp, and began the usual process. Wet the film, shake the chemicals, check the timer. I was standing over the trays, watching the images appear on the paper. My legs were restless, as if they wanted to run. My stomach was tight. Then the safety lamp flashed 3 times in quick succession. The dark shapes on the developing tray blurred for a moment. I felt a chill down my spine. I grabbed my flashlight, turned it on, and scanned the corners of the room. Everything was where I had left it, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was behind me. I ended up throwing a whole sheet of wet photographic paper on the floor. I muttered a few curses and cleaned up, but the tension remained. I decided to cut the session short. The following week, I tried to ignore the oddities. I convinced myself that the old wiring in the basement was causing the flickering. I told myself that the tripod was moving because I was clumsy. I insisted that the shadow on my negatives was a defect. But each excuse seemed weaker than the last. Every time I set foot on the first step, leading down to the basement, a wave of anxiety washed over me. My palms sweated, and the hairs on my arms stood on end. I remember one morning, around 10 o'clock, when I thought that maybe going down there during the day would help. Sunlight streamed into the rest of the house, but the basement was dark, as always. I opened the door, turned on the regular ceiling light, not the red safety lamp, and looked around the small space. The floor looked damp. I heard the low hum of the dehumidifier in the corner. My tripod was set up in the same place, near the wall. My solution bottles were lined up on a makeshift table. Everything looked normal. I took a few steps forward. The ceiling light began to flicker. It clicked several times, and then settled into a steady, dim light. The air was cool, but not cold. I could see my breath for a moment, which wasn't normal in a heated basement like mine. My heart started racing again. I kept telling myself it was just a faulty circuit. I didn't see or hear anything else, so I got to work, developing more film. As I rinsed the negatives, I heard that metallic sound again. It was faint, like the tripod legs scraping the floor. I spun around, illuminating the corners with my small work flashlight. The tripod seemed to have turned slightly to one side. I gripped the flashlight so tightly that my knuckles hurt. I took a few slow steps toward it. The metal legs were spread out. The handle was locked. I pressed to see if it was loose. It seemed normal. I moved it an inch or so and went back to my tray. I tried to ignore the pounding in my head. Later that night, I compared the new negatives with the old ones. The same shadow was there, right behind me in 2 photos. Still faint, still in the same position. My throat went dry. I rubbed my eyes, hoping I was seeing something else, but it was clear. The shape was there. My stomach churned. I thought about giving up on the dark room altogether, but I couldn't let it go. It seemed too important. I wanted to find out what was causing it. I kept working in the basement, always nervous. Every time I reached the last step, my muscles tensed. Sometimes I heard small noises at the far end of the basement, behind some old shelves. Other times, I thought I felt a breeze on the back of my neck. Once, while mixing the developer, I heard breathing that wasn't mine. It was slow, shallow, like someone standing a few feet away. I turned around, shining my flashlight. There was no one there. The hairs on my arms stood on end. My stomach clenched, and I had to fight hard not to run back up the stairs. A few nights ago, something new happened. I was crouched over the developing tank, changing the film rolls, when the security lights flickered. I braced myself for the usual sounds, but instead, the flickering lasted longer, about 2 seconds. It was almost completely dark. At that moment, I felt pressure against my back, like a hand pressing gently between my shoulder blades. I gasped and dropped the film. The lights came back on. There was nothing behind me, and I didn't feel any more pressure, but my skin was damp. I could feel my heart beating in my ears. I stood there, breathing heavily, trying not to panic. I decided I couldn't deal with this alone. I tried to explain the situation to a friend, but he just laughed and told me that basements can be scary. He suggested I install better lighting and maybe a security camera. The idea made sense, so I set up a small camera that records when it detects movement. I pointed it toward the work area, focusing on the tripod, the table, and the wall behind me. That made me feel a little safer. although I still felt that knot in my stomach every time I turned off the ceiling light and turned on the red lamp. I left the camera running for a few nights and then checked the recordings. Most of it was me moving around, taking photos, adjusting the chemicals, but 2 minutes into the second night's session, I saw the tripod move half an inch to the left without anyone touching it. There was no one else in the frame. I rewound the recording several times, thinking maybe I had bumped it, but my hands never came close. The camera showed me standing next to the table with my back to it, and the tripod had slid a little, as if someone had pushed it. I watched the rest of the recording with my pulse racing. Nothing else happened, but it was enough to make my face flush and my breathing quicken. Since then, I've tried to go down there as little as possible, but I still need to develop film if I want to continue photographing the way I do. Every time I go in, I keep one eye on the tripod and one on my equipment. I've established a routine. I turn on the red light, check the chemicals, keep my phone handy in case I panic, and then I start developing. I listen for any noises. I keep the camera on. I try not to think about the shadow that keeps appearing in my photos. Last night, I went downstairs with a new roll of film from a shoot I did outside an old warehouse. I turned on the red lamp, and the basement seemed colder than usual. The dehumidifier was off. I pressed the power button, but nothing happened. I wiggled the plug, but it still didn't work. I shrugged and started working. The water in the developing tank felt colder than usual to the touch. The smell of chemicals also seemed stronger. My eyes stung a little. I heard a faint click in the corner as if someone had tapped the metal. I tried to ignore it. My heart was racing and I was sweating. Halfway through the process, the lights flickered again. 3 quick pulses, and then the basement ceiling light turned on by itself. I know I didn't turn it on. I saw the reflection on the concrete wall. My chest tightened and I felt dizzy for a moment. I kept telling myself it was the wiring, that maybe I had left the switch in some intermediate position, but that didn't help me relax. I walked toward the door to turn off the ceiling light. When I reached it, I heard a scratching noise right behind me. I turned around, illuminating my tripod with the flashlight. It was at a different angle again. My hand was shaking. I couldn't move for a few seconds. I stared at the tripod, waiting for it to move again. Nothing else happened at that moment. I turned off the ceiling light, made sure everything was secure, and finished developing as quickly as possible. When I got upstairs, I closed the basement door and leaned against it. I was breathing fast and could feel my shirt sticking to my back. I looked at the time on my phone. It was only 10 p.m. I felt like I had been down there for hours. I went to my living room, closed all the curtains, and sat down, trying to calm myself down. I keep telling myself that it's all in my head, that maybe I'm scaring myself with every little noise. But the negatives and the images on the camera don't lie. There's something in that basement with me. I don't know what it is, but I feel it every time I go in there. My body reacts before my mind can come up with excuses. My skin tingles, and my heart tries to jump out of my chest. Now I'm at a point where I have to make a decision. I could lock the dark room, put my equipment upstairs, and send my films to a lab like everyone else. Or I can try to get some answers. Part of me wants to install more cameras and maybe a voice recorder. Another part wants to tear down the dark room and pretend none of this ever happened. Every time I think about going down there, my stomach churns and I start to sweat. But I can't walk away from something that seems to demand my attention. That's why I'm up here, writing all this, with the basement door locked behind me. The house is silent. I can hear the hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. The lights are on, and my phone is next to me. I feel safer up here, but there's a little voice in the back of my mind telling me that I can't ignore what's going on in the basement. The question is whether I'm brave enough or foolish enough to keep investigating. Right now, I'm not sure which I am. All I know is that the next time I go down those stairs, I'll be listening for every click, every scratch, and every change in the air. and I'll keep my eyes on my tripod, hoping it stays exactly where I left it. If it doesn't, maybe I'll finally decide that enough is enough. But until then, I can't stop looking over my shoulder, and I can't shake the feeling that something is watching me. Next story. I never thought an old toolbox would keep me up at night. At first, I was just happy to have a bunch of decent tools for home repairs, but then I started hearing noises. Now, every night, I lie in bed with my eyes wide open, waiting for that metallic squeak to return. Here's what happened. My uncle moved abroad about a month ago. Before he left a wooden toolbox at my house. He was in a hurry and said, "Here, I won't need these where I'm going," and left for the airport. I picked up the box and felt its weight. It was heavy. I heard metal clinking inside. I shrugged and took it to my garage. I remember leaving it on my old workbench near the back wall. The wood felt rough and the hinges squeaked when I opened it. Inside were some wrenches, a pair of pliers, and a hammer that looked worn. The handle had dark stains, and the head was chipped around the edges. I didn't think much of it. I like fixing things, so I was glad to add these tools to my collection. I took out the wrenches, gave them a quick clean, and put them back in the box. I noticed that the hammer handle had small splinters along the grain. It felt strange in my hand, so I set it aside and went on with my evening. That was the first day. Around midnight, I heard a strange noise, like a scratch. At first I was half asleep. I thought it was just a stray cat outside or maybe the wind, but it continued, a slow, drawn-out squeak of metal. I got out of bed and grabbed a flashlight. I went to the garage in my slippers. When I turned on the light, everything seemed normal. The toolbox was there with the tools inside. The only strange thing was that the ladder was leaning slightly away from the wall. I adjusted it, turned off the light, and went back to bed. I tried to forget about it the next morning. I found the hammer on the workbench. I could have sworn I had left it in the box. I picked it up, looked around, and wondered if maybe I had left it out by mistake. I decided I must have. I put it back in the box and went to breakfast. That night, around 11:30 p.m., I heard the scratching again. This time it sounded more like metal hitting something, like a tool hitting concrete. I felt a chill in my chest. It wasn't that cold in the room, but my arms were covered in goosebumps. I grabbed my flashlight again and went to the garage. I opened the door, turned on the light, and stared. The hammer was standing on its head, leaning against the corner of the bench. I stood there, silent, for about 10 seconds. My pulse quickened and I felt a bead of sweat trickling down my cheek. I walked over and picked up the hammer. I checked the box. Everything else seemed to be in its place. The keys were stacked inside, the pliers inside. I put the hammer back in the box, closed the lid, and went back inside. I closed the door behind me. For a moment, I considered the possibility that someone was playing a joke on me. Maybe a neighbor had a key, but that didn't make sense. The garage door was locked and the windows were intact. The only other entrance was the door to my hallway. I went to bed feeling uneasy, but tried to block it out. On the third night, I heard a loud bang. It sounded like metal hitting wood hard. I opened my eyes wide and my heart began to race. I grabbed the flashlight again. My feet felt heavy as I walked toward the garage door. I opened it carefully, turned on the light, and found the hammer resting on the bench with the handle pointing directly at the door. I looked for any signs of forced entry, but found nothing. No broken windows, no footprints, no damage to the door. I stood there swallowing hard, feeling my mouth go dry. I decided to put the hammer in one of my tool drawers. I had a drawer with a simple metal latch. I put the hammer inside and closed it tightly. I said out loud, "That's enough," although I didn't know who I was saying it to. My voice sounded shaky. I went out, closed the garage door, and went to my room. In the morning, I went to check. The drawer was wide open, the latch was loose, undamaged, and the hammer was back on the bench. I felt a cold rush of adrenaline in my arms. My hand was shaking. I picked up the hammer and turned it over. The handle looked a little darker than before, but maybe it was just my imagination. I swallowed hard, took a deep breath, and tried not to think about it too much. I closed the toolbox and moved it to another part of the garage. I put it in a cabinet near the door. I locked the cabinet. That night, I paced around my living room, unable to relax. I turned on the TV, but the volume seemed too loud. Every few minutes, I turned off the TV, trying to listen for any noises. Around 12:15 a.m., I heard a soft thumping sound. It was steady, as if someone was knocking on a wall. I realized it was coming from the garage. My skin felt clammy. I grabbed the flashlight, my breathing rapid and shallow. I opened the garage door, turned on the overhead light, and looked around. The closet door was open, and the toolbox was on the floor. The hammer was on top of the box, as if someone had placed it there on purpose. I approached slowly. My legs felt weak. I was alert, looking for movement in the corners. I didn't see anything out of the ordinary, except the tools. I tried to speak, but my mouth was dry and my voice sounded shaky. "Is anyone here?" There was no answer. The air smelled a little moldy, like old metal and dust. The whole time I felt pressure in my chest. I decided to take the hammer to the other side of the garage. I put it on a shelf behind some paint cans and then dragged an old suitcase in front of the shelf to block it. I left the toolbox on the bench and closed everything up again. I went inside, made myself a cup of coffee, and sat down at the kitchen table, staring at the clock for an hour. I waited, making no noise. I tried to calm down, but my leg was still shaking under the table. I felt shaky, my heart was still racing. The next morning, the hammer was back on the bench. The paint cans were scattered, and the suitcase had been moved a few inches. This time, I felt a surge of anger. I cursed under my breath and walked over to the bench. I looked at the hammer. I saw dust on the head and some small splinters of paint near the handle. I picked it up and put it back in the toolbox, then left. I spent the rest of the day trying to keep myself busy with household chores. I kept thinking about the possibility that someone had broken in, but the doors were still locked. Nothing was missing except my sense of security. That night, I went to bed early. Around 2 a.m., a noise woke me up. It sounded like nails scratching the concrete floor of the garage. I could feel my pulse pounding in my ears. I got up with my heart racing and put on my slippers. I grabbed my flashlight and walked toward the garage door, but I froze before I could touch the doorknob. I didn't want to open it. I stood there breathing fast, my hands shaking. Then I turned the knob and turned on the light. The toolbox was open. There was a pair of pliers on the floor. The hammer was back on the bench. I walked over to the bench, bent down to pick up the pliers, and felt a sudden rush of cold air like a draft. My skin tingled. My eyes scanned the room, but I didn't see any open windows. I put the pliers back in the box and closed the lid. Then I stood there, breathing heavily, waiting to see if anything moved. Nothing moved, but I felt like I was being watched, as if someone was right behind me. I turned around, flashlight in hand, shining it into the corners, behind the boxes, under the table. There was no one there. I closed the toolbox, put a small padlock on it, and left. When I woke up the next day, I ran to the garage to check. The padlock was still on the box, but the hammer was on the floor next to the workbench. I looked at the closed box with a heavy heart. The key was still in my pocket. The padlock was undamaged. I had no explanation. I leaned against the wall, staring at the hammer, breathing through my mouth because my nose felt congested with anxiety. I decided to gather all the tools and put them in the trunk of my car. I picked up the box with the hammer inside. The box seemed lighter than I expected. I paused and then realized that the hammer wasn't inside, which was why it weighed less. I picked up the hammer and threw it into the box. I locked the padlock and took everything to my car. Then I drove to a warehouse a few miles away and rented a small storage unit. I left the toolbox there, locked the unit, and drove home. For a moment, I felt relieved. I went back to my garage. It looked empty. My workbench was clean. The air smelled normal. I walked carefully, almost expecting to hear a crash or a scratch, but I heard nothing. That night I slept without hearing anything strange. The next morning was quiet. No tools were out of place, no banging. The garage remained silent. But on the second night after putting away the toolbox, I woke up around 3 a.m. I heard it again, metal scraping against the concrete floor. My heart skipped a beat. I sat up in bed, feeling my muscles tense. My palms were sweaty. I got up and walked to the garage door. I opened it, turned on the light, and froze. The hammer was back on the workbench. There were no signs of forced entry, no footprints on the floor. I stared at it, my heart pounding. I said, "This is impossible." I checked the trunk of my car. Empty. I checked the corners of the garage. Nothing there. I stood by the workbench, feeling my stomach shrink, my mind filled with questions. I still haven't gone back to the storage room. I can't explain how the hammer got back there. I haven't seen my uncle since he left. I tried calling him, but his number goes straight to voicemail. I'm not sure what I would say to him. Your toolbox is haunted. Sounds ridiculous, but every night I hear it. Every night I open the garage door and see that hammer lying there, waiting for me. I've moved the workbench. I put a new lock on the door. Nothing works. I feel its presence every time I walk into that space. My chest tightens, my breathing quickens, and I feel dizzy. I haven't told anyone else. Part of me feels ashamed. Part of me fears they won't believe me. Right now, the hammer is on the floor, near the steps leading up to my house. I can see it from where I stand. I try to ignore it. I have a strong urge to pick it up and throw it away, but I'm also afraid to touch it. I'm afraid of making things worse. I feel trapped by an object that shouldn't have any power over me. I stand there, listening for the next scratch, the next metallic noise. My mouth is dry and my hands are shaking. I stare at the hammer. I wonder if it's watching me. I don't know how to end this. I don't have a solution. Every time I lock that thing away, it comes back. Every time I try to ignore it, it draws me back in. It makes me feel like I'm being watched. It makes me sweat. It makes my heart beat so hard that I have trouble breathing. I don't hear any voices, but I feel like there's someone in the room. I feel a weight on my shoulders, as if I'm not alone. I can't describe it with fancy or pretty words. It just scares me and I don't know what to do. Tonight I can take the hammer to a junkyard and leave it there. I can throw it away outside the city. I'm desperate. I want my life back. I want to walk into my garage without feeling a knot in my stomach. I want to sleep through the night without waking up drenched in sweat, listening to a noise that makes my hair stand on end. I can't go on living with this toolbox. I can't keep checking that bench for signs of movement. I can't keep feeling my chest tighten every time a pipe rattles or the wind blows. I'm writing this now, standing in my garage with the lights on, trying not to look at that hammer. I hear little clicks in the corner. I feel my legs shaking. If I pick it up, I'll feel its worn handle and chipped head. If I walk away, it'll still be here tomorrow. I don't know if I can leave it behind, but I know I can't go on like this. My uncle left me this problem, and I want to get rid of it. I'm about to wrap it in an old rag, put it in my truck, and drive away. I don't care where I take it, I just need to get it out of my life. It's the last thing I can think of doing. If it comes back after that, I don't know what else to try. I'm afraid of my mind. I just want to free myself from this hammer and stop hearing those noises at night. Next story. I hate walking through that parking lot at night. Every time I step on that cold concrete, I feel a wave of unease. The air seems heavier, as if it's pressing down on me. I can't explain it well, but I know something's wrong. It's not just my imagination because I've heard other people mention it too, although they don't talk much when I'm around. They make little comments like, "Yeah, that place is creepy," or "I don't like parking too far away." I always shrugged it off until I started noticing things myself. I work in a factory in an industrial area. My shift usually starts around 9 p.m. and ends a little before dawn, depending on overtime or equipment problems. The parking lot is huge. The streetlights are far apart, and there are places where darkness gathers in thick layers. You can't see much in those corners unless you use a flashlight or walk right up to them. I used to park my car near one of those streetlights, but lately I've been parking closer to the entrance. I'm not sure if it helps, but it feels a little safer. I first noticed something was wrong a few weeks ago. I remember that night clearly because there was an eerie silence in the factory. The machines were running, but there was no usual chatter. People seemed more focused on finishing their work and less on socializing. When my shift ended, I walked out to the parking lot alone. The air was cold and the wind was kicking up dust. I heard a soft scraping sound against the concrete, as if someone were dragging their feet. At first I thought it might be my shoes, so I stopped walking, but the noise continued. Then it stopped for a second, as if whoever or whatever was making it realized I was listening. I tried to look between the rows of parked cars, but I couldn't see more than a few feet ahead. The overhead lights were very dim, and the shadows seemed denser than normal. I felt an irresistible urge to hurry, so I started walking faster. I was about 12 meters from my car when I felt someone watching me. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end, my chest tightened, and I could feel my pulse pounding in my ears. I looked around again, but saw nothing. I told myself I was just nervous. As I approached the driver's door, I noticed something moving on the other side of my car. It was a black shape, low to the ground. I could see part of a shoulder or an arm, maybe. I froze. My heart was beating so hard that I was sure anyone nearby could hear it. I waited a moment, hoping to see some sign that it was just a coworker playing a joke. But the shape disappeared behind another car, smoothly and silently. That was what impressed me most. It moved silently. I unlocked the car, got in, and closed the doors. My hands were shaking as I searched for the keys. I kept looking in the rearview mirror, hoping to see something appear behind me, but the parking lot seemed empty. Then I started the engine and drove away. As I pulled away, I scanned the area once more. The overhead lights barely illuminated the area, and I couldn't locate the figure again. I told myself it must have been some kind of trick of the shadows, but I didn't believe it. The next night, I parked in a different spot, closer to the entrance, hoping to feel better. But around midnight, I had to pause and go out to get something from my car. The hallway leading outside had a metal door with a small glass window, and when I looked through it, I had a clear view of part of the parking lot. I saw movement between the cars just for a second. It looked like a figure running from one row to another. I thought it might be a security guard making his rounds, so I waited, but no one else came through that door. No one knocked or opened it. There was no sign of a uniform, no beam of light, nothing to indicate that it was an official security guard. I went back inside and mentioned to a coworker that I could swear I had seen someone outside. He barely looked up from his phone and said, "Yeah, you see weird things outside sometimes. Probably just your eyes playing tricks on you." I didn't pursue the conversation, but I could tell he was avoiding the subject. I wondered if he had had his own encounters, but didn't want to talk about it. That same coworker left before me. When I clocked out, I heard the door close behind me and the night air rush back in. It was a little warmer than the night before, but the darkness seemed the same, thick, oppressive. I walked out to my car, trying to keep my breathing steady. My footsteps echoed. I heard another sound, like footsteps a few seconds behind me, so I stopped walking. Everything was silent. I started walking again, and once more, I heard that same rhythm, step, 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 behind me. I turned around quickly, but there was no one in sight. I ran to my car and opened the door. As I did, I heard a slight scratching sound on the ground behind the vehicle. It was as if someone was crouching down, scraping their shoes against the cement. I got in, locked the doors, and grabbed the steering wheel. My heart was pounding. I thought, just drive. So I turned the key, started the car, and drove away. All the way home, I kept looking in the rearview mirrors. My palms were sweaty and my shirt was sticking to my back. I had this lingering feeling that I wasn't alone, even though the car was empty. Over the next few days, I tried to ignore it. I focused on my tasks at work, operating the machines, doing quality checks, talking to my supervisor about deadlines. I told myself I was probably just stressed and imagining things, but every night the walk back to my car became more tense. I started carrying a small flashlight and shining it between the rows of cars, hoping to catch whoever was out there. Sometimes I saw a flash of movement, a foot sliding behind a wheel or a silhouette diving out of my field of vision. Every time I ran over, I found nothing. One night in particular, I was so nervous that I didn't dare leave right away. My shift ended at 3 a.m., but I stayed until almost 4, waiting for the feeling to pass. When I finally left, the parking lot was almost empty. Only a few cars remained scattered in the dim light of the street lamps. At first, I stayed close to the building, shining my flashlight on the ground. I didn't see anything. I walked toward my car with the flashlight pointing forward. Halfway there, the beam of light fell on a pair of shoes peeking out from behind another car. They were black, worn, and facing my direction. Then they moved back out of the light. My heart began to pound in my chest. I shouted, "Hey, who's there?" There was no answer. I quickly approached the spot, waving the flashlight from side to side, but I saw nothing. There was no one behind that car. I looked under the nearby vehicle, but saw nothing but concrete and shadows. My hands were shaking again. I stood up and ran to my car, got in, and locked the doors. That was the first time I almost considered calling the police, but what was I going to say? That I had seen a pair of shoes in the shadows. I wasn't even sure they'd give me a proper answer, so I left. After that night, I started to feel panic even before my shift began. I could handle the work. The machines didn't scare me. The long hours, the noise, the possibility of getting my hand caught in a press. Those were risks I knew. But this was different. It felt personal, like there was something out there waiting for me. I told myself it could be an intruder or maybe a homeless person hiding in the parking lot. But why would they keep following me, moving from row to row? I asked a few coworkers casually, "Hey, have you noticed anything strange out there at night?" One of them, a guy named Mark, shifted uncomfortably and said, "Sometimes I feel like I'm not alone, but I've never seen anything." Another coworker, Tony, just nodded when I mentioned it, then changed the subject as if he didn't want to talk about it. That only made me more suspicious that something was really going on, and we just didn't know how to deal with it. I couldn't shake the tension. Every night around midnight, I felt a knot in my stomach. I found myself thinking about the parking lot when my shift ended. I gathered my things hastily as soon as the clock struck the end of my shift. I wanted to run to my car, but I also knew I had to control myself or I would seem paranoid. Sometimes I would leave in a group, hoping that would stop the feeling, but I still felt that presence or heard a faint whisper in the distance. No one else mentioned it in front of me, but the looks on their faces told me they felt it too. One night, about a week ago, I had a close encounter. I was leaving after working overtime, so it was almost 5 in the morning. The sky was faintly lit by the approaching dawn, but the parking lot was still almost dark. As I approached my car, I thought I saw someone crouching between it and the car next to it. This time I decided to be more direct. I straightened my shoulders and walked slowly, illuminating the ground with my flashlight. My heart was beating so hard I could feel it in my throat. When I got to the back of my car, I heard a sharp intake of breath, as if someone was panting. I moved the flashlight in that direction and caught a glimpse of a face. It was pale, with wide eyes staring directly at me. Then it disappeared. I didn't have time to process it. I jumped, almost dropping the flashlight, and staggered backward. I turned around quickly, trying to see where that person had gone, but when I got to the other side, there was nothing but darkness. My stomach was in a knot. My legs were shaking, as if they were about to give way. I got into my car and locked the door. I sat there for a few seconds, panting, trying to steady my hands. I remember thinking, that was a real person, not just a shadow. My skin felt clammy, and I was sweating despite the cool air. I drove home in a near panic, checking my rearview mirror every few seconds. I couldn't get that face out of my head. I started wondering if I should report it, but I had no description beyond that pale face and those frightened eyes. It could have been anyone. I didn't see any distinguishing features and had no idea what they were doing. Maybe it was someone looking for valuables in cars, but why keep lurking there night after night, in plain sight? Why the shuffling footsteps and silent movements? Since then, I've changed my routine. I try to leave at the same time as other co-workers and walk with at least 1 or 2 people. I don't like going out alone. When I have to go alone, I keep my flashlight on and my keys in my hand. Tension fills me the moment I push that metal door open. The wind outside always seems a little too cold, and the shadows seem a little too dense. My heart races, my jaw tightens. I constantly look around, trying to catch the slightest movement. I see my breath in the air when it's cold. I hear the hum of distant traffic on the main road, the click of the security camera on the side of the building, the faint buzzing of the lights above, and underneath it all, I keep thinking I hear footsteps. They never sync perfectly with mine, always seeming to arrive a step or 2 behind, as if whoever it is wants me to know they're there, but doesn't want me to see them. When I finally reach my car, I unlock it, get in, and lock it immediately. I check the mirrors, turn on the interior light for a second, and scan the back seat. I don't see anyone. Then I start the engine, usually with trembling hands. My chest tightens, and my mouth goes dry. If I see any movement around me, I freeze for a moment, but then I force myself to reverse and drive away. When I get to the main road, my whole body is tense, and I can't breathe properly until I'm a few miles away. I've thought about switching to the day shift or looking for another job, but the pay is good here, and there aren't always daytime positions available. Besides, I feel like if I give up and leave, I'll never know what's really going on in that parking lot. Part of me wants to catch whoever is out there, just to put an end to this feeling. Another part of me wants to forget everything and move on. Now, every night, I mentally prepare myself for that drive to the car. I tell myself to stay calm and keep my eyes open, but no matter how hard I try, the fear doesn't go away. There's always that split second just before I open my car door, when I'm convinced there's someone on the other side of the vehicle waiting for me to let my guard down. I imagine a face suddenly appearing at the window, staring at me through the glass. I start breathing faster, my muscles tense up, and I feel that wave of panic coming on. I haven't seen that pale face again, but I feel like it could appear at any moment. And every time I drive home, I expect to see something in the rearview mirror. Sometimes, I catch myself looking at the back seat more than once at traffic lights, worried that someone crouched there has escaped. I don't sleep well either. Sometimes I wake up during the day thinking I hear shuffling footsteps outside my window, but it's just my mind playing tricks on me. I don't know how this is going to end. I don't know if I'll ever face whoever is lurking out there. Maybe it's one person, maybe it's several people, or maybe it's just some lost homeless person wandering around the parking lot. All I know is that I dread the end of my shift. I dread that long walk across the concrete under those dim lights, between rows of dark cars. And the worst part is, I feel like this isn't over. Every time I step into that parking lot, I brace myself for the next strange sight or sound, and so far it keeps happening. I just hope it never gets worse than it already is. Next story. I took that temporary job in a coastal town because I wanted a change of scenery. I was tired of my old routine and thought a few months near a long beach would give me a break. I was wrong. I'm telling this story because it still makes me nervous. I can't forget the things I heard at night, or the strange feeling that accompanied me on those deserted beaches. Every time I remember it, my stomach churns and my hands sweat. I haven't talked about it much, but I need to get it off my chest. The place was about a 3-hour drive from my hometown. The town itself seemed normal when I arrived. There was a long main street with small shops on either side and a large supermarket half a mile from the beach. The roads were practically empty, except for a few cars parked near a small cafe. The buildings looked faded, perhaps because the salty air had affected them over the years. I arrived at noon, parked my old car, and grabbed my suitcase. I didn't see many people on the street, just a few elderly people sitting outside a convenience store, drinking something. They barely looked in my direction. I had already arranged for a small studio 2 blocks from the beach. The owner told me it was furnished and the rent was cheap. When I stood in front of it, I noticed peeling paint on the walls and some rust on the metal fence surrounding the small yard. Still, I was happy to have a place so close to the sea. I went inside and found a narrow living room with a small kitchen in one corner. There was a rickety table near the window and a small sofa bed against the opposite wall. The floorboards creaked when I set down my suitcases. The smell of salt air hung in the air, even with the windows closed. I opened one of them to let in some fresh air, but the breeze that came in was damp and left a slight sticky feeling on my skin. That first afternoon, I just unpacked my bags and then went out to buy some groceries. Work wouldn't start until the next day, so I had time to settle in. I brought back a few items to fill the fridge. After putting everything away, I decided to head down to the coast. I wanted to see what the beach was like up close. As soon as I stepped outside, I heard the distant roar of the waves. The sky was cloudy and there wasn't much light, but I could still make out the coastline in front of me. When I reached the sand, I realized how deserted the area was. The beach stretched out in both directions, with some large rock formations jutting out near the water. I saw some seagulls jumping and pecking at something near the tide line, but I didn't see anyone else. I stood there for a minute listening to the waves. They were breaking constantly. My shoes sank a little into the wet sand, and my nose filled with the strong smell of salt. I felt a slight chill from the breeze coming off the water. After a while, I went back to my spot. I planned to get up early the next day and figure out how to get to my temporary workplace. That night I slept well, although around midnight I noticed a slight dripping outside my window. I thought it was just water from the gutters, or maybe something left over from the rain that had fallen earlier. I forced myself to ignore it and went back to sleep. The next morning I woke up to the dim light of the sun filtering through the blinds. My first day at work went without incident. I spent most of my time running errands and organizing inventory. My supervisor was a quiet man in his 50s. He showed me around the small warehouse, explained my duties, and then left me to get started. At lunchtime, I sat alone on a bench behind the building. I could smell the ocean even there, a few blocks away. My co-worker, a guy named Dave, waved at me as he left, but we didn't talk. The day ended, and I went home thinking I would take another walk on the beach after dinner. That night, I heated up a frozen meal and ate in front of the open window. I could see a patch of sky with dark clouds moving slowly. A gust of wind blew in, and I felt a chill on my arms. My plan was to walk along the beach and then go home and sleep. But when I stepped outside, something seemed wrong. There was no one on the street. The air felt heavy, and the wind died down, leaving everything too quiet. I went to the beach anyway, thinking that would relax me. The moment I reached the sand, I heard something behind me. At first, they sounded like soft footsteps matching mine. I stopped and turned around. There was no one there. The beach stretched out in all directions. There were no houses on the immediate coastline, just dunes and some beach grass. The only visible structures were a few lifeguard towers in the distance. I thought maybe I was tired, so I shrugged it off and kept walking. A few seconds later, I heard the footsteps again. They seemed to be in sync with mine, stopping when I stopped, moving when I moved. My heart raced and I scanned the area for any sign of another person. Still nothing. I tried to walk faster, but the sound continued. I thought about shouting, but I felt silly. Instead, I turned around once more and took a few quick steps backward, keeping my eyes on the deserted sand. I didn't see anyone. The waves continued to break, steady and high. I swallowed hard, my mouth dry. I decided that was enough for one night, so I ran back to my building. The footsteps didn't follow me after I left the beach. When I reached my door, my pulse was racing and my breathing was ragged. Once inside, I locked everything. I checked the windows twice. I kept telling myself it was my imagination, maybe an echo of my own footsteps, but I couldn't shake the uneasiness. The next few days passed without incident. I kept working, buying groceries and staying home. I stopped going for walks on the beach because I felt that same lingering uneasiness whenever I thought about going out at night. However, on the fourth night, I decided to try again. I wanted to prove to myself that I was just being paranoid. I left around 9 p.m. The streetlights flickered in the breeze. A distant light hummed softly, emitting a faint glow. As I approached the shore, I smelled the salt in the air again, strong enough to make my nose tingle. I stepped onto the sand and took a deep breath. The tide was low, and a wide expanse of wet sand glistened in the moonlight. I walked toward the water. After a few minutes, I heard that same pattern of footsteps. They matched the rhythm of my own footsteps. I turned around, and all I saw was my shadow cast by the half-lit moon. My skin prickled, and I felt sweat forming on the back of my neck. My heart was pounding. I wanted to scream, but my throat was tight. I told myself it was echoes, that maybe the hollow space under the boardwalk or something was causing it. But then I realized there was no boardwalk there. There was only open beach and dunes. I walked a little further, keeping my eyes fixed on the area behind me. My chest felt heavy, and every breath seemed too loud. The footsteps continued for a few moments and then stopped. I stood still, waiting, my hands shaking at my sides. The sound did not return. I turned to continue, but then I heard a splash in the water. It wasn't a gentle wave. It sounded more like someone entering the ocean. I tried to see who it was, but there was no one visible near the water's edge. I backed away, feeling my heart pounding in my ears. My thoughts were racing. I was alone out there. I saw no sign of anyone else. The ocean looked dark with faint reflections of the moon on the surface. I decided to go home. I walked quickly, trying not to run, but my muscles felt tense. When I got back to my street, I noticed a wet spot on the sidewalk, as if water had pooled there, but the sky was clear. I noticed drops falling toward a side alley. It was strange. I shook my head and went inside. I didn't sleep well that night. I kept hearing dripping sounds on my small balcony. I went out to look once, hoping to see a leaky pipe, but everything seemed dry. Still, the smell of the sea was overwhelming. It even overpowered the musty smell of the old sofa. I felt a headache coming on, so I took a painkiller and managed to fall asleep. My dreams were filled with the sound of waves and visions of empty sand under a cloudy sky. I woke up more tired than when I had gone to bed. My work continued as normal the next day. I tried to keep my mind busy by reviewing files, labeling boxes, and reorganizing supplies in the warehouse. Dave invited me to grab a quick coffee with him. I wanted to ask him if he had experienced anything strange at the beach that night, but I didn't want him to think I was going crazy, so I just drank my coffee and chatted for a while. He mentioned that the town was very quiet out of season and that most tourists only came during the summer. I nodded, pretending I wasn't feeling uneasy about the deserted beach. A few nights later, I decided to stay at the beach a little later. Part of me wanted answers. Part of me wanted to prove I wasn't afraid. I waited until almost 11 before leaving my studio. The night sky was almost black, with only a few faint stars. The The wind was colder than usual, and I zipped up my jacket. My ears went numb after a few minutes, so I shoved my hands into my pockets. I walked down to the sand, staying close to where I usually entered the beach. The moonlight was dim, but I could see enough to avoid stepping in a tide pool. I walked along the shore, scanning the area near the rocks. That's when I saw a silhouette. It was a man standing completely still, facing the water. His figure was just a dark outline against the faint glow of the moon. He was near a cluster of rocks where the waves sometimes broke. I stopped, my heart pounding. I opened my mouth to call out, but felt a lump in my throat. I forced the words out, something like hello or hey. The man didn't move. He just stood there, facing the water. I decided to get closer. My pulse was pounding in my neck, and my legs felt stiff. Each step crunched the wet sand. I got to about 6 meters away. The man's silhouette remained motionless. I couldn't see his face or his clothes in detail. Suddenly, a gust of cold wind blew through me. It cut through my jacket and made me shiver. A strong smell of salt filled my nose, almost burning my nostrils. I shielded my face with one hand, squeezing my eyes shut against the sudden force. When I looked back, the silhouette had disappeared. He hadn't walked away. He was simply no longer there. I stood frozen, staring at the empty spot. The only sounds were the water lapping against the shore and my own breathing. My hands were shaking, and I felt a wave of nausea wash over me. My mind was filled with possibilities. I wondered if he had hidden behind a rock. I scanned the area, taking a step forward, but there was no sign of him. I backed away, my feet unsteady. I turned and stumbled down the beach. My lungs felt tight, and each breath scratched my throat. I reached the street and realized my vision was blurred by tears caused by the cold wind. I forced myself to calm down before entering my building. When I reached my studio, I closed the door behind me. I pressed my back against the wall and let out a shaky sigh. My muscles felt weak, and I collapsed to the floor. My clothes smelled strongly of salt, as if I had been very close to the waves. I looked out the window, but I couldn't see the ocean from there. I kept listening to the faint dripping on the balcony. My stomach churned. I looked at the clock and saw that it was almost midnight. I took a long shower, letting the hot water run over me, but I still felt uneasy. I hardly slept that night. I woke up every hour, convinced I heard footsteps in the hallway. From that moment on, I could no longer ignore the strange sensations. The dripping on my balcony would start randomly, sometimes around 2 or 3 in the morning. I would get up, look outside, and see nothing but a wet spot on the cement. The strong smell of the sea seemed even more intense, especially in the early hours of the morning. It filled my study, clung to my clothes, and got into my nose, so much so that I could taste salt when I swallowed. I tried to avoid walking on the beach at night, but my curiosity kept pushing me. I thought maybe I could find that man again. One night, I stood on my porch at sunset, staring at the horizon. The sky was gray, and the ocean looked dark. I didn't see anything unusual from where I stood. I told myself I would go down just to take a quick look, stay close to the entrance, and come right back. Then I put on my jacket and went outside. I walked slowly, looking around every few steps. The streets were empty, most of the houses with their lights off. I reached the sand and looked around. There were no footprints except mine. The ocean roared in the distance. I felt my legs tense. I stood there for a minute, then turned and walked away. I didn't want to tempt fate. I got home, locked the door, and tried to distract myself by reading the local newspaper, but I couldn't concentrate. My eyes kept drifting to the window. The night passed without any new noises, but I still felt nervous. A few more days passed and my work was done. My contract was for a short period, so my time in the city was coming to an end. I spent my last day cleaning the studio and packing up my things. I returned the key to the landlord and mentioned the strange dripping sound I had heard at night. He shrugged and said something about the pipes sweating from the salty air. He didn't seem to care. I loaded my bags into the car and looked down at the beach one last time from the end of the street. The wind brought back that strong smell of the sea, almost making me choke. I drove away feeling relieved and disturbed. Even now I still think about those footsteps that matched mine in the sand. I remember the cold wind blowing through me and the silhouette near the rocks. Sometimes I hear those drops in the middle of the night, like an echo in my head. I don't know if that man was real or if there was something else lurking on those deserted beaches. All I know is that my stay there was not the relaxing break I had hoped for. It filled me with a tension I can't forget. Even at home, miles away from that ocean, I sometimes wake up in the dark, my heart pounding, and I smell that salty air. Then I wonder if he's following me. Next story. I never liked that back porch. It's at the end of a narrow hallway in my one-story house, and the glass door leading out to it almost always sticks. I moved here a few years ago and never cared much for that area. It seemed damp, and the door used to stick in the frame. Most of the time, I stayed away from it. I'd go out to sweep it every now and then, but most of the time I just left it alone. All that has changed recently, and now I find myself looking over my shoulder every time I walk down that hallway. Last week, I decided to clean the porch. It was a random decision. I had been there maybe half a dozen times since I bought the house. The floor was covered in leaves and dust, and the door frame was full of debris. I thought I'd give it a good scrub and finally see if I could get the door to work better. I put on some old clothes and grabbed a broom, a rag, some cloths, and a bucket of soapy water. The door stuck as usual, and I had to pull hard to get it to slide open. The smell of mold hit me immediately, like old socks mixed with wet wood. I stepped inside and saw that the entire balcony was a mess. The windows looked dirty, the screens had cobwebs in the corners, and the tile floor felt damp and rough under my shoes. In the back corner, I saw a piece of furniture. It was a single chair, looking like an old armchair or something. There was mold on the edges of the upholstery, and a thick layer of dust made it look almost gray. I had no idea it was there. I figured maybe the previous owners had left it there. I started cleaning, sweeping up leaves and cleaning the windows. I spent a few hours just removing the dirt and grime. I walked around the perimeter of the room and finally came to the corner where the chair was. The fabric looked stained, and one arm had a tear with the stuffing coming out. The other arm seemed to have a dark stain from mold. I touched it lightly and felt the fabric disintegrate under my fingers. It was damp. The smell was worse near the chair, like mold. I cleaned it as best I could and left it to air out. I didn't bother trying to move it that day because I was already exhausted. I spent a little more time cleaning the door track and spraying it with lubricant. When I was done, I closed everything up, left the chair where it was, and went back to the main house. I took a shower and forgot about it. Later that night, I heard a creaking sound. I was in my living room watching a show. I paused the TV and listened. The sound was faint, as if something was shifting or swaying against a hard surface. My living room shares a wall with that porch, so I thought maybe it was the windows or a branch outside. But then I realized the sound seemed closer. It was a slow, steady squeak that made me think of an old rocking chair. But I knew there was no rocking chair out there, just that dusty armchair. I got up and walked into the hallway. The light was off, so I turned it on and looked toward the glass door. The squeak stopped. I stood there for a moment, feeling a slight sense of unease. The door was closed, but I could see the outline of the balcony in the dim light filtering through. The armchair was in the corner. I didn't see any movement. Everything seemed still. I shrugged, turned off the hallway light, and went back to the couch. As soon as I got comfortable again, I heard the creak. It was the same sound, a soft moan, as if a weight was settling on a piece of furniture. My stomach churned. I grabbed a small flashlight from the coffee table, went back to the hallway, and turned on the light again. The creak was still there. I slid the door open. It moved a little easier now, though it still stuck in the frame. I stepped out onto the balcony. The first thing I noticed was the smell. Even though I had cleaned up, there was a damp smell everywhere. I scanned the area with the flashlight. The windows were closed. The chair was where I had left it, near the back wall, but I could have sworn the armchair was moving. It wasn't a big movement, just a slight shift, as if someone had leaned back and left it tilted. I approached, my pulse pounding in my ears. I pointed the flashlight at the seat cushion. It looked slightly sunken, as if someone had just gotten up. The fabric had a depression in it. My mouth went dry and I ran my hand over the cushion. It was warm, like the heat from a body that lingers in a bed after someone has been lying there. I jumped back. My heart was pounding in my chest. I couldn't see anything else strange. The windows were locked. The door was closed. I reached out and tried to push the chair across the floor, but it wouldn't move. It seemed much heavier than it should have been. It wouldn't slide. I had to make a real effort to move it a few inches. The legs squeaked against the tiles, and I felt a wave of anxiety wash over me. I left it there and ran inside, closing the glass door behind me. That night I could hardly sleep a wink. My mind kept replaying the sensation of that warm fabric. I live alone and don't get visitors very often. There's no reason why that chair should have been warm. I tried to convince myself that there was some strange source of heat, maybe a pipe under the porch or something, but that didn't explain why it seemed to be shaped like a person. The next day, I opened the balcony door again, determined to check the area in daylight. I walked around and inspected all the windows. None were broken. I tried to see if there was a vent blowing warm air onto the chair, but I only found one at floor level, near the door. It wasn't pointing anywhere near the corner. The balcony looked normal that morning. The chair looked the same, still moldy, still dirty. I touched the seat cushion and it was cold. I decided to move it. I thought about throwing it away or leaving it outside to dry. Maybe the weirdness would go away if I got rid of it. I bent down and grabbed the sides, but when I tried to lift it, it felt solid, as if it were filled with something heavier than foam. I could lift one corner, but the other side dragged like an anchor. Finally, I managed to drag it across the balcony floor, making a terrible scratching noise. I moved it away from the corner, more toward the center of the room, and then pushed it toward the door, intending to take it out that way. But the width of the door was a problem. The arms of the chair were too wide to fit through easily. I would have to tilt it or turn it on its side. After struggling for a while, I realized I needed a second pair of hands, or I would risk getting it stuck in the doorway. I was already sweating and panting. I decided I would call a friend later that week to help me. For the time being, I left the chair near the door and went back to my normal day. That night, at about the same time as before, I heard the squeak again. It was softer, but still noticeable if I stopped what I was doing and listened. I walked over to the glass door and looked inside. The chair was now in the middle of the balcony, not near the wall. It looked like it had turned slightly, at a different angle than I had left it. I stood there staring for a moment, feeling a chill run down my arms. I told myself that maybe I had forgotten the exact position, but I was sure I had left it facing the opposite direction. My hand was shaking a little as I grabbed the door handle. I wanted to check if the sliding mechanism was locked. The handle was cold. I slid the door open and went in. The smell of damp was stronger at night. I walked over to the armchair and stood in front of it. My skin prickled. I expected it to start moving on its own, but it didn't. It was motionless. The cushion looked untouched. I touched it again. This time it was warm, not as hot as before, but definitely not as cold as the air around it. I quickly pulled my hand away. I decided to push the chair all the way to the edge of the balcony. I didn't like having it near the door. I felt it was too close to my personal space. I put my hands on it and pushed it across the floor. It squeaked again, making my ears ring. As I pushed it, it felt heavier than it looked. My muscles were tense and my back was starting to hurt. Finally, I managed to push it against the far wall. It was almost where it had been originally, except a few feet further away from the corner. I took a deep breath, my heart pounding, and went back inside, locking everything. I tried to watch TV, but my mind wasn't there. I kept looking down the hallway. The house was silent except for the hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. Then, half an hour later, the creaking returned. It was a slow, low, rhythmic sound. I turned up the volume on the TV, but I could still hear it. My stomach churned. I walked down the hall, turned on the porch light, and looked through the glass. I saw the armchair rocking slightly forward and then backward, as if someone were adjusting their posture. I stopped breathing for a second. I didn't see anyone. There was no one there, just the chair moving in small, steady movements. I felt a bead of sweat trickle down my temple. I wasn't sure if I should open the door again, but something compelled me to do so. I slid the door open slowly. The creaking continued for a moment longer, then stopped. I went in, my mouth dry. I didn't see anything out of place, except for the cushion on the armchair, which was pressed down again. I stood there holding my breath, waiting for something else to happen. After a long moment, I reached out and touched the fabric. It was warm. Goosebumps broke out on my skin. A wave of panic washed over me, and my hands began to shake. I didn't want to stay there. I never wanted to touch that chair again. I backed away and went into the house, locking the door behind me. I turned off the porch light, but left the hallway light on. I ran to my room and closed the door. I spent the night tossing and turning in bed, waking up with a start at the slightest noise. I felt nervous, as if someone were in the house, but I was alone. Finally, I got up around 5 in the morning and made coffee. I stood staring down the hallway, wondering what to do. I wanted that armchair to disappear, but I didn't want to deal with it alone. Around noon, I called a friend to see if he could come over the next day and help me move the armchair to the sidewalk. He said yes. I spent the rest of the day avoiding the porch. I didn't hear any noise during the day, which made me think that maybe it was all in my imagination, but I knew that the weight and heat weren't imaginary. That night, I was in bed around 11 when I heard the creaking again, faint but present. I threw back the blankets, my pulse pounding in my neck. The sound was constant, like a soft rocking. I tried to ignore it. I closed my eyes, but I couldn't sleep. Finally, I got up, grabbed my flashlight, and walked into the hallway. I stood there, my heart pounding. I could see the silhouette of the chair through the glass. It looked like it was moving, but the shadows made it hard to be sure. I walked away without opening the door. I hardly slept. In the morning, my friend arrived. I told him about the armchair, but left out the strange details. I just told him it gave me the creeps, and that I wanted to get rid of it. He shrugged and said he would help me. We went to the balcony and found the armchair exactly where it had been. Together, we tried to get it through the door. It was still very heavy, but between the two of us, we managed to tilt it and maneuver it through the doorway without too much difficulty. It took a lot of effort and pushing, but we managed to get it into my garage. My friend asked me why the chair seemed wet. He noticed that his hand smelled moldy afterwards. I just told him it was old and damp from being on the porch. We left it next to the trash cans. He left. I went back inside with a sense of relief. That night, I kept watching the garage entrance. The chair was still there under the streetlight. Garbage pickup was scheduled for the next morning, so I figured that would be the end of it. I went to bed around midnight. I was half asleep when I heard a noise in the yard. It wasn't a squeak. It sounded like a dragging, as if something was being dragged. My throat tightened. I sat up and listened. I heard a dull sound, like a scratch, near the back door of the porch. The door swung once and then stopped. I turned on the bedroom light, my heart racing. I grabbed the phone and walked toward the hallway. I turned on all the lights along the way. The porch was dark. I stood near the glass door looking out. I couldn't see anything. Then a gust of wind shook the windows, and I realized my mind might be playing tricks on me. I told myself the chair was outside, near the sidewalk. After standing there for a few minutes, I went back to my room and finally fell asleep. The next morning, I ran outside to see if the garbage men had taken the chair. I looked at the sidewalk and saw nothing but a wet spot on the pavement. The chair was gone. I looked up and down the street, but there was no sign of it. I felt a mixture of relief and unease. Maybe someone had taken it before the garbage truck arrived, or maybe the truck had come earlier than usual. I never heard it, though, but I convinced myself that it was gone for good. I went back inside and made breakfast. For the first time in days, I felt almost normal. I thought, that's it, problem solved. But later that night, I was walking down the hall and heard a short, distinctive squeak. I froze. It was coming from behind the glass door. I turned on the hallway light and looked through the door. It was too dark to see much. I felt a tingling sensation on my skin. I pressed my ear against the glass. There was no sound. I never heard the creak again, at least not clearly, but some nights when the house is quiet, I think I hear a faint whimper or movement on the porch. I look through the glass and see nothing. The space is empty. There is no furniture there now, just the tiled floor and the windows. Yet sometimes I could swear I hear that weight settling into the armchair that is no longer there. And every time my stomach churns, and I feel the urge to leave the hallway and lock my bedroom door. I keep telling myself it's my imagination, but at night I avoid looking too closely through the balcony door. I can't shake the feeling that something is sitting there, even though there is no armchair. No matter how many times I tell myself he's gone, I can't forget the warmth I felt when I touched the cushion. I can't forget the slow rocking motion I saw, and I can't forget the creaking sound that still seems to echo in the silence when I'm alone in the dark. Next story. I remember the first time I saw that pocket watch. My cousin gave it to me at the airport before he left for Europe. He put it in my hand and said, "I don't want it anymore. It works strangely." I looked at it and shrugged. I didn't understand what he meant by strange. It was just an old pocket watch with a stained case and a chain that looked like it had seen better days. I put it in my jacket pocket and went home without giving it another thought. Now I wish I had let him keep it. I'm not one for keeping antiques or old gadgets. I like modern things. I rely on my cell phone to tell the time. I don't wear a wristwatch, so it never occurred to me to carry a pocket watch. When I got home, I put the watch in my desk drawer. It had a small key to wind it up, but I didn't bother. I locked the drawer because I keep some important papers there, so I forgot about the watch for a few days. I had work to do, chores to run, and no reason to think about an old watch. About a week later, I was sitting in my home office. It's a small room with a desk, a computer, and a bookcase. I was writing some emails and started to hear a soft ticking sound. At first I thought it might be my desk clock, but I don't have a desk clock. I only have a wall clock, and that makes a slight clicking sound every minute, not a steady ticking. This was different. It was steady. Tick, tick. It sounded muffled, as if it were coming from behind something. I stopped typing, listened carefully, and realized it seemed to be coming from my desk drawer. This confused me because the clock was there, but I had never wound it. Besides, I keep that drawer locked. I grabbed my keys, unlocked the drawer, and opened it. I saw the clock sitting there. The hands weren't moving. I picked it up. It was cold and still, but there was still a faint ticking sound in the room. It wasn't loud, but it was enough to make my hair stand on end. I looked around the room, looked under the desk, behind the computer. Nothing else could be making that noise. I put the clock back in the drawer, closed it, and locked it again. The ticking stopped after that. I stood there for a while trying to figure out if maybe I was hearing things because of stress. Finally, I sat down again, opened my emails, and tried to forget what had happened. 2 nights later, I got up around midnight to get a glass of water. My throat was dry, and I couldn't sleep. I went to the kitchen, turned on the light, and poured some water from the filter jug. As I brought the glass to my lips, I heard that ticking sound again. This time it wasn't coming from my office. It seemed to be coming from the living room. My whole body tensed up. I could feel my heart beating in my chest. I put the glass down on the counter and took a step toward the living room door. My living room is connected to the kitchen by a small hallway. There was a small table lamp on a side table near the sofa, but it wasn't on. The only light came from the kitchen behind me. As I entered the living room, I flicked the light switch. The ceiling light is quite bright, so everything was suddenly illuminated. That's when I saw the clock. It was on my coffee table. The chain was neatly coiled to one side. I froze. There was no reason for the clock to be there. I kept it locked in my desk drawer. I could feel the sweat on my forehead. My hands started to shake a little. I tried to calm myself by breathing slowly several times. My heart seemed to be beating too fast. I stared at the clock for a long time. The ticking stopped. The watch looked the same as before, with dull metal and a few smudges around the edges. There was nothing obviously strange about it, except for the fact that it had moved on its own. I picked it up and felt its weight in the palm of my hand. The hands still didn't move. I listened for a ticking sound directly in my ear, but I heard nothing. It felt like a piece of metal, not unlike a broken piece of hardware. I put it back on the table, took a few steps back, and tried to understand what was happening. I went to my office and checked the drawer. It was still locked. I opened it and found the space empty. The watch wasn't there. I rubbed my temples. I thought maybe I had lost it, but I remember putting it away, and I know I didn't take it out. It didn't make sense. I went back to the living room and looked at it again. My legs were shaking. I had the urge to throw it away, but part of me wanted to keep it, as if it might help me figure out what was causing these strange events. I decided to put the watch in a metal box where I keep some old coins. That box has a small padlock. I put the watch inside, locked it, and put the box in my closet. Then I double-checked the closet door. It has a simple latch, but I locked it from the inside anyway. I felt silly doing it, but I needed to feel safe. I went back to bed. I tossed and turned, thinking about that watch, but eventually I fell asleep. I told myself I was probably just exhausted, maybe confusing dreams with reality. A few days later, I started to feel something else. Those strange moments when I would look at the time, have a rough idea of what time it was. And then when I looked again, much more time had passed than it should have. I would open an email on my computer at 10 a.m., read it for what seemed like 2 or 3 minutes, and then the clock on my screen would read 10:20. I would think, did I get distracted for 20 minutes? Or I'd be making breakfast. Glance at the time on the oven, say it was 7:15, and when I served the food, the oven clock would read 7:35, even though it felt like only 5 minutes had passed. At first, I blamed my own distraction. I work from home so I can lose track of time, but it kept happening and it bothered me. One afternoon, I decided to see if the clock had anything to do with these time jumps. I went to my closet and took out the locked box. I opened it, and there was the clock, still cold, still lifeless. I held it up to the light in my room. The face had small cracks. The glass was slightly scratched. I took the small winding key I had kept in the same box. I considered winding it just to see if it worked, but I hesitated. I immediately felt a knot in my stomach. My mouth went dry. I placed the clock on my dresser and took a step back, watching it as if it might start ticking on its own. It remained silent. I left it on my dresser for a day or two. Nothing happened. No ticking, no strange movements, no distortion of time that I could definitively link to it. But I continued to notice strange jumps in the wall clock in my office. It seemed like I would sit down to do a single task that should take me 10 minutes, and the clock would read half an hour. My heart would race every time I noticed it. I started to worry about my health. I thought maybe I had some kind of neurological problem, but I never felt sick and never had headaches or dizziness. I was just wasting time. One night, I decided to try something different. I grabbed my phone and opened a stopwatch app. I wanted to time myself doing a simple task, like writing a paragraph for work. I put my phone next to my keyboard and stared at it. It was around 8 p.m. I started typing, but I felt anxious. My mind wandered to the clock on my dresser in the other room. After a few lines, I glanced at the timer. It read 002.15, 2 minutes and 15 seconds. Then I heard a soft ticking sound somewhere in the house. My body tensed up. I jumped out of my chair and ran to my room. The clock was on the dresser, but I heard the ticking even louder in the hallway. It was that same steady ticking. I walked toward the room, my scalp tingling and my pulse pounding in my ears. When I entered the room, the clock was no longer on the dresser. It was on the floor near the bed. The ticking continued and seemed to be coming directly from the clock, but the hands weren't moving. I bent down, picked it up, and held it in the palm of my hand. The ticking stopped. I stared at it, waiting for something else to happen. My phone was still in the other room, so I had no idea how much time had passed. I ran back to the office and looked at the stopwatch. It read 2:50 p.m. I felt a knot in my stomach. It had been more than 12 minutes since I left my desk, and I was sure I hadn't spent more than a minute or two checking the room. I tried to keep a cool head. I grabbed a notepad and wrote down the times I saw. I wrote 8:00, started writing, 8:02:15, looked at the stopwatch, 8:14:50, returned. Then I tried to compare it to the wall clock. The wall clock read 8:14. My phone said 8:14, so the stopwatch was probably right, but it felt like only 2 minutes had passed, not 12. My hands were shaking so much that I could barely write. I turned off the computer, put the clock back in the metal box, and put it in the closet. I decided I would try to forget about it for a while. For a few days, I tried to keep myself busy. I avoided going into my room unless I needed clothes or to sleep. I set up a folding bed in my office for quick naps during the day, so I could work without worrying about the clock. I felt stupid for letting an object control my behavior, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The house seemed tense. Every noise, every creak in the walls made me nervous. I kept checking the locks on my closet door and the small padlock on the metal box. I also kept the drawers in my desk locked, even though I had removed the clock. One night, I was watching TV in the living room. It was around 9:30. The program was a random series about mechanics rebuilding old cars. I wasn't really focused on it. I just wanted some background noise. Then I heard the ticking start again. My whole body went rigid. I looked over at the coffee table. The clock wasn't there. I looked under the sofa cushions, under the table. Nothing. The ticking grew louder. It was coming from the hallway leading to my office. I turned off the TV, got up, and slowly walked toward the hallway. My heart was beating so hard that I felt breathless. I reached the office door and pressed my ear against it. The ticking was coming from there. I grabbed the doorknob and opened the door. The lights were off, but there was enough ambient light from the living room to see inside. The clock was on my desk chair. My palms began to sweat. I turned on the light and looked at it. The clock looked the same, matte metal, scratched face. The chain hung down from the back of the chair. I swallowed hard and moved closer. The ticking continued, almost as if it were mocking me. I reached out to grab the clock, but the moment my fingers touched it, the ticking stopped. I felt an intense chill run through my entire body. My mouth went completely dry. I could barely swallow. At that moment, I decided I had to get rid of it. I went to the garage and found an old cardboard box. I put the watch inside, sealed it with tape, and wrote "trash" on the side. I planned to drive to a thrift store and leave it there, but I was so nervous that I went back inside, drank a glass of water, and tried to calm down. I told myself I would do it first thing in the morning. It was too late to go out, and the thrift store would be closed. I left the cardboard box in a corner of the garage. I made sure it was securely closed. I hardly slept that night. I kept thinking I heard a faint ticking sound, but I told myself it was just my imagination. I covered my head with the blanket, as if that would protect me from my own fear. My muscles were tense, and my stomach churned every time I closed my eyes. I imagined the clock in the living room or on my desk. I kept imagining that somehow it found its way back to my room. But eventually, I fell asleep. The next morning, I ran to the garage. The box was still in the corner, exactly where I had left it. I exhaled with relief. I put it in the trunk, drove across town, and parked behind a thrift store that accepts donations in a drop-off area. I left the box on the donation shelf and got back in my car. I felt a wave of relief. I drove home and tried not to look back. I told myself it was over. If the clock wanted to wander around someone else's house, that was fine with me. I spent the rest of the day tidying up. I swept the floors, dusted the shelves, and even rearranged some furniture. I wanted to reclaim my house as a normal place before nightfall. I felt calmer. I made dinner, watched some TV, and tried to enjoy the silence. But I couldn't quite relax. I kept waiting to hear that ticking again, or to find the clock on the coffee table. I checked my locked drawer, my closet, and the metal box just to be sure. Everything was normal, exactly as I expected. After that, I tried to get the clock out of my head. It's been several days now, and I'm still nervous. Every now and then, I think I hear a faint ticking sound, but it might just be my nerves. I still notice those strange time jumps from time to time, but they're less intense now that the clock is gone. Maybe it was all in my head, and I just needed to get away from that strange object. Or maybe there was something about that watch that affected my perception of time. I don't know, and I'm trying not to think about it too much. I just hope that whoever ends up with that thing doesn't experience the same disturbing moments I did. If they do, they'll probably wonder what's wrong with them. And if they ever find me, I won't have a good explanation. I'll just tell them the same thing my cousin told me. That clock is strange, and I didn't want it anymore. Next story. I moved into this ground floor apartment because I wanted privacy. The high walls surrounding my private patio seemed perfect. I thought I had found my own little fortress. I never expected that the darkest corner of that outdoor space would keep me awake at night. I noticed the damp patch on the first day I arrived. It was late afternoon, and I went outside to take a quick look at the property boundaries. The walls were solid and tall, and the entire outdoor area was paved, except for a narrow strip of dirt against one side. Everything looked decent, except for a patch of mold in the far corner. That area didn't get any sunlight. The smell there was damp and strong. I didn't like it, but I figured I'd deal with the mold later. I unpacked my moving boxes and thought that I'd fix everything up over time. I remember the first night I was sitting in my living room checking some emails when I heard a soft thumping coming from outside. I paused and listened. It sounded like a slow, dull thump against the wall. It wasn't loud, and it sounded like something was scraping or scratching on the other side of the concrete. The sound lasted a few seconds and then stopped. I shrugged it off, thinking it was an outside noise or maybe a neighbor. It seemed silly to worry about it, but it happened again an hour later, shortly after midnight. It was a brief sequence of taps or scratches, and then silence. The hairs on my arms stood on end because it sounded very close, as if it were coming directly from that damp corner. The next morning, I went out to examine that corner more closely. The mold stain had spread. It formed a dark, irregular pattern on the lower part of the wall. I moved closer, and a cold, damp breeze brushed my face. It felt like a draft, but there were no openings or vents. The walls were solid. I put my hand on the surface. It was cold to the touch, and there were drops of moisture clinging to the wall. I scraped it lightly with a screwdriver I found in my toolbox. The mold came off in thin layers, leaving a slimy residue on the metal. I felt a little nauseous when I saw it. The place made me uneasy, but it was just mold, so I told myself it was normal in a damp, shady area. That night, I placed a plastic garden chair in that corner, thinking I could try to block any strange drafts. I also wanted to see if it was still damp under the objects. I went to bed and slept well until 3 a.m., when I was awakened by a slight scratching noise. I got out of bed, walked to the sliding glass door leading to the patio, and looked outside. The night light in the patio was dim, but I could see something that looked like movement near the corner. I froze. My heart was pounding, and I felt sweat on the palms of my hands. I stared for about 30 seconds. I didn't see anyone. I didn't see any animals either. The noise stopped. I stood there for another minute, tense, but finally went back to bed. In the morning, I checked the corner. The chair wasn't where I had left it. It was 2 or 3 feet away from the wall, pushed to one side. There were slight scratch marks on the concrete, as if it had been dragged. It didn't look like wind damage. I tried to push the chair to see how easily it moved. It was quite light, but the scratch marks suggested deliberate movement. I saw no footprints or signs of intrusion. The high walls and locked door made it unlikely that anyone had entered. Still, it unsettled me. I looked up at the sky and realized how shady that area was. The sun never reached it. The rest of the courtyard got at least a few hours of light during the day, but that corner remained dark. I tried to calm myself by focusing on normal tasks. I unpacked more boxes and assembled some furniture. However, I couldn't stop thinking about that moldy area. That day, I decided to scrub the wall to see if I could get it completely clean. I bought a bottle of stain remover, a stiff brush, and a mask. The smell of the product mixed with the smell of mold made me cough a little. I spent about half an hour scrubbing the wall. The mold stained the brush, and the water that came out was dark gray. After rinsing the wall, I saw that the stain was still there. It was lighter, but it didn't come off completely. I decided to let it dry and try again another day. That night, I heard the scratching noises again. This time, it sounded like a single knock, a pause, and then a slightly louder scratch. I walked over to the sliding door and turned on the outside light. Nothing was moving, but I heard the faint echo of something scraping against the wall. I felt my heart racing again. I opened the door just enough to step outside. The cement was cold under my bare feet. I took a few steps toward the corner, feeling my chest tighten. A sudden chill ran through my body coming from that direction. I stopped where I was. Everything was still. I stared at the wall and felt that something was wrong. The house next door was dark. The street was quiet. I didn't see or hear any people or animals. I backed away and went inside, trying to stay calm. After locking the door, the noise stopped. The next morning, I found my cleaning supplies bucket moved about a foot from where I had left it. There were fresh scratch marks on the wall, small and shallow, as if someone had scraped the surface with a sharp object. I ran my finger over the marks. They were rough, tiny flakes of dried mold or perhaps concrete dust stuck to the tip of my finger. I considered the possibility that there had been an intruder, but how could they have gotten in or out without me noticing? The door was locked, the walls were high, and the main entrance to the building was a long hallway away. I started to feel nervous about being there alone at night. I decided to install a small security camera pointing directly at that corner. It was a simple setup, a Wi-Fi camera with motion detection and night vision, plus an SD card for local recording. I tested it by waving my hand around the corner. The recording seemed clear. That night, I left the camera on. I went to bed around midnight. I woke up shortly before 6 a.m. and checked the footage. The file ended around 3 a.m. with a corrupted video. The last minute or so was just jumbled pixels, and then it cut off. The camera was still working, but the recording had stopped. I took out the SD card and tried to view it on my laptop. Nothing. Everything was static from a certain point on. I had no explanation. The device itself showed no signs of damage, but the data was useless. I tried again the next night, this time with a different memory card. Same thing, corrupted files after a few hours. I tried a third time, connecting the camera to a different power source, but the problem persisted. I didn't see a single clear frame of what happened after 2 or 3 in the morning. I started to wonder if there was some strange interference or maybe a camera malfunction, but it seemed more personal. Every time I checked the corner, something was moved or knocked over. I spoke to my neighbor, a retired man who lived upstairs. He told me he had never heard anything suspicious at night and had never had any mold problems. He asked me if I might have a rodent problem. I considered it. Could rats or other animals be responsible? But I didn't understand how they could drag a chair or a bucket without leaving signs like droppings or rodent marks. The neighbor suggested calling the landlord to have a mold inspection done, but I was the owner of the apartment, so it was my responsibility. I called a professional mold removal company to get an estimate. They told me they would charge a lot to treat the wall with special chemicals and maybe install a dehumidifier in that corner. I made an appointment for the following week. In the meantime, the noises continued every night. It was always the same pattern, faint banging or scratching, usually shortly after midnight. They never lasted more than a few minutes. Sometimes I tried to ignore them, but I ended up getting out of bed anyway. I would walk over to the sliding glass door, look outside, and never see anything. When I gathered enough courage to go out, the air near that corner felt heavy and cold. If I left anything in that corner, I would find it slightly moved the next morning. One night, around 2 a.m., I decided to go back to the wall. I had the flashlight on my phone turned on, pointing directly at the mold stain. The mold seemed thicker than before and had an irregular shape. The smell was horrible. As I got closer, I thought I saw a slight ripple in the texture, as if the mold were moving. I blinked, took a step forward, and looked again. Up close, they were just damp spots on the concrete. But something about the surface made me shiver. They looked like dozens of tiny pores, each releasing moisture. My stomach churned. I took a step back. At that moment, my phone's flashlight flickered for a second. It had never done that before. The battery was full. My phone was undamaged, but the light flickered again and then stabilized. I turned around and walked straight inside. I closed the door and locked it. My heart was beating so hard I could hear it in my ears. I tried to sleep, but every time I closed my eyes, I imagined that mold creeping up the wall. I imagined it spreading across the patio floor, inch by inch, or seeping under the door. My rational mind told me it was just mold in a damp corner, but my instincts screamed that something else was going on. I felt tightness in my chest. I was breathing faster than normal. I forced myself to lie down and calm my heart rate. It seemed like hours before I fell asleep. When the mold removal team arrived, I was exhausted. 2 guys in uniform showed up with equipment, a chemical sprayer, protective gear, and a large industrial fan. They took a look at the corner and said it was a pretty bad infestation. I stepped aside and let them do their work. They scraped off most of the mold, applied a strong cleaner, and then used a fan to help dry the area. They left after an hour, telling me to keep an eye on it and let them know if the mold came back. They also told me that I might need to improve the ventilation in the patio, but it was basically an enclosed space, so the options were limited. That night I went to bed feeling more optimistic. The wall looked cleaner, and the smell wasn't as strong. I slept until almost 5 a.m. without interruption. Then I heard it again, a series of soft thumps. I jumped out of bed, ran to the patio door, and turned on the light. The mold hadn't completely disappeared. A new stain was already spreading across the base of the wall. The air was cold again. I stepped out cautiously. My bare feet touched the damp concrete. The moisture had returned to that corner. I watched as drops of moisture formed along the newly cleaned surface. I stood there for a minute, listening for movement. Nothing else happened. The tapping had stopped as soon as I opened the door. In the morning, I checked the camera recordings. They were corrupted again, at exactly the same time. I felt a knot in my stomach. I began to doubt myself. Was I imagining things? Was my camera faulty? I tried a different brand of camera, but the result was the same. The recordings were corrupted after a few hours, with no apparent explanation. I considered sleeping in the living room with the sliding door open, just to keep an eye on that corner. But the idea of spending the whole night staring at that dark spot made my hair stand on end. Instead, I tried to come up with a plan. First, I bought a motion-activated floodlight. I installed it on the patio ceiling so that it would shine directly on the corner. If anything moved there at night, a bright light would come on. The installation took me a few hours. I tested it at night by waving my hand in the corner. It worked. Around 1 a.m., I was still awake, looking at my phone, when I heard a clicking sound coming from outside. Then the floodlight came on. I got up, grabbed a metal flashlight, and ran to the sliding door. The floodlight was shining, but I saw no movement. I opened the door and stepped outside. The corner was illuminated, and mold glistened like black slime on the wall. The air reeked of mold. I looked around, walked to the wall, and found nothing. No intruder, no animal. I stood there feeling my heart race, listening. The light went out after a minute because there was no movement to keep it on. I stood in the darkness, alone with the flashlight illuminating the damp wall. I heard a dull sound behind me, like a hoarse exhalation. I turned around. The air was still. I saw no one, nothing. I backed toward the door, refusing to turn my back on that corner. Then I went in and locked the door. I could still feel my pulse throbbing in my neck. Over the next few weeks, I tried everything. I used different cleaning products, placed several dehumidifier packets in the corner, and even left a fan on outside. Nothing solved the moisture problem. The mold kept coming back. Every few nights, I heard that knocking or scratching noise. Every few nights, something moved in the corner. The camera kept failing to record. My upstairs neighbor still knew nothing. He claimed he couldn't hear anything. I called an electrician to check if there were any wires behind the wall that could be causing interference. There weren't any. The walls were solid concrete. I called the plumber to check for leaks. He couldn't find any problems with the pipes. I started to dread the night. I stayed up late, alert in bed, waiting for the banging. It never happened at the same time. Sometimes it was around midnight, other times as late as 3 or 4 in the morning. But it always sounded the same, like a slow, deliberate knock on the other side of the wall, followed by a slight scratch. My chest tightened, and I felt a cold sweat on my forehead. I couldn't relax. My mind was filled with thoughts of something lurking out there. Every time I gathered the courage to go out, the noise stopped. Every time I tried to capture it on camera, the recording was corrupted. I even considered selling the apartment. The idea of living with this strange, unsolved problem weighed heavily on me. But I had just bought it. The real estate market wasn't great, and I didn't want to explain to a potential buyer that there was something strange in the corner of the patio. So I stayed. I tried to keep everything normal. I went to work, cooked dinner, watched TV, played on my phone. But my mind never completely let go of that uncomfortable feeling of unease. One night, I decided to sit near the sliding glass door in the dark and just watch. My plan was to wait for the bang and then turn on the light manually. I sat there with a glass of water, breathing slowly, trying to stay calm. Around 2 a.m., I heard the first faint bang. My heart raced. I held my breath and listened. Another knock, then something like a scratch or a scrape. I turned on the emergency light and pressed my face against the glass. The corner lit up, and I saw a slight movement on the wall. It was as if the surface was rippling, but maybe it was just water dripping. I couldn't be sure. I stared for about 20 seconds. The movement didn't repeat itself. My face was only a few inches from the glass, and I felt a sense of panic. That corner looked damp, but there was nothing else there. When the banging stopped, I realized my hands were shaking. My mouth was dry. I was breathing heavily and felt tightness in my chest. I sat there for a few more minutes before finally walking away. I didn't sleep much that night. Now I live with this routine. The mold is still there, no matter how much I clean it. The camera still malfunctions at night. The banging and scratching continue. I keep hoping to catch someone sneaking in, but there's never anyone there. Sometimes I see fresh scratch marks on the concrete. Other times, I find random objects moved around. I even tried leaving a large, heavy flower pot in that corner, thinking it would be too heavy to move. One morning, I found it moved an inch away from the wall. I can't say I've solved anything. I haven't seen a ghost or a person. I haven't found a physical explanation. All I know is that corner is always damp and cold, and something happens there at night. I've tried to be firm about it, but it still bothers me. Every time I hear that knock, my heart races. Every time I see something moved, my stomach churns. That's how it is. I own this place. I can't afford to move. I have no proof that something is actively invading the house, but I also have no normal explanation for these events. The mold removal team said they may have to rip out part of the wall to really address the source of the moisture. That means more time, more money, and no guarantee that it will solve the strange nighttime activity. But I may do it anyway, just to see if there's anything hidden behind the wall. For now, I'm on alert. I have my floodlight, my camera, and my flashlight. I keep my phone charged in case I need to record anything. I try to tell myself that it's probably just a weird moisture problem combined with my imagination. But deep down, I don't really believe that. I can't deny the things I've seen with my own eyes and heard with my own ears. Tonight I'm going to try something new. I'll put my phone on a tripod, point it at that corner through the sliding glass door, and record directly to my cloud storage. If that fails too, I'll have to accept that there's something out there that I can't explain. Either way, I'll keep trying to figure it out. I'll keep facing that dark, damp spot. I can't pretend it's not there. Whether it's mold or something worse, I'm living with it in my own backyard. If I ever get answers, I'll make sure to tell you all about it. But for now, I'm still in the dark, listening to those silent knocks on the other side of the wall.